Welcome to this deep exploration of one of the most influential works in Western philosophy, Plato's The Republic. Over the next few hours, we're going to journey through this monumental text together, examining its arguments about justice, the ideal society, the nature of the soul, and what it truly means to live a good life. We'll break down each section carefully, look at key passages and quotes, explore the philosophical reasoning behind Socrates' arguments, and really dig into why this dialogue has captivated readers for over 2,000 years. Whether you're encountering the Republic for the first time or revisiting it with fresh eyes, this video aims to make Plato's complex ideas accessible and engaging. So let's dive in. Book 1. The Challenge to Justice. The Republic opens not with abstract theorizing, but with a scene of ordinary life. Socrates, our main speaker throughout the dialogue, recounts going down to the Piraeus, the port of Athens, with Glaucon to attend a religious festival. After watching the procession, they're about to head back to Athens, when they're spotted by a group that includes Polemarchus, who playfully insists they stay for the evening festivities. This casual, almost humorous beginning sets up what will become one of the most intense philosophical investigations ever recorded. The group makes their way to the house of Cephalus, Polemarchus's elderly father, who is a wealthy resident alien in Athens. Cephalus is performing religious rites when they arrive, and after the rituals, he engages Socrates in conversation. Now, this opening conversation with Cephalus is critically important because it establishes the central theme that will dominate the entire work. What is justice, and why should we be just? Cephalus represents the traditional, conventional view of morality. He's an old man reflecting on his life, and he tells Socrates that having wealth in old age is valuable primarily because it allows him to be just. He doesn't have to lie or cheat, and he can pay what he owes to gods and men before he dies. For Cephalus, justice seems straightforward. It's about telling the truth and paying your debts. This definition sounds reasonable on the surface, and many people might find it satisfying. But Socrates, being Socrates, immediately sees problems. He offers a counterexample. Imagine you borrowed weapons from a friend when he was in his right mind, but now he's gone mad and demands them back. Surely, Socrates suggests, it wouldn't be just to return weapons to someone who might harm themselves or others, nor would it be just to tell the complete truth to someone in that state. This simple thought experiment dismantles Cephalus's definition. Justice cannot be reduced to truth-telling and debt-paying, because there are obvious situations where doing these things would produce unjust or harmful outcomes. Cephalus, perhaps recognizing he's not equipped for this kind of rigorous examination, excuses himself to attend to the sacrifices, and his son Polemarchus takes up the discussion. Polemarchus wants to defend and refine his father's view. He cites the poet Simonides, claiming that justice means giving each person what is owed to them. But what does what is owed actually mean? Through questioning, Socrates gets Polemarchus to specify justice means helping friends and harming enemies. This idea that justice involves benefiting those close to you and hurting those who oppose you was widespread in ancient Greek culture. It's a kind of reciprocal morality. Be good to those good to you and bad to those bad to you. But again, Socrates finds problems. First, people make mistakes about who their real friends are. Someone might seem friendly but actually wish you harm, while someone who seems opposed to you might actually have your best interests at heart. If justice is helping friends and harming enemies, but we're wrong about who our friends and enemies truly are, we could end up acting unjustly while thinking we're being just. Polemarchus adjusts his definition. Justice is helping those who are truly good friends and harming those who are truly bad enemies. Even this refined definition doesn't satisfy Socrates. He probes deeper. What does it mean to harm someone? If harming someone makes them worse, and if justice is a human excellence or virtue, then harming people would make them less just. But can it really be the function of justice to make people less just? Can the just person exercising their justice make others unjust? This seems like a contradiction. Socrates draws an analogy. Heat makes things hot. It doesn't make things cold. Excellence in horsemanship makes horses better, not worse. So how could justice, which is an excellence, produce injustice in others. Through this line of reasoning, Socrates leads Polemarchus to abandon his definition. Justice cannot involve harming anyone, even enemies, because harming people makes them worse. And making people worse in terms of human virtue would mean making them less just. At this point in the dialogue, we've seen two conventional definitions of justice demolished. Cephalus' simple definition, truth-telling and debt-paying, failed because it didn't account for circumstances where these actions would cause harm. Polemarchus' more sophisticated definition, helping friends and harming enemies, failed because it relied on our ability to correctly identify friends and enemies, and because the very idea that justice involves harming anyone contradicts the notion that justice is a virtue. These refutations are classic Socratic method. Take a commonly held belief, examine it through questions and counterexamples, and reveal its inadequacy. Now enters one of the most dramatic characters in the entire dialogue, Thrasymachus. He's been listening to this conversation, growing increasingly frustrated, and he finally bursts into the discussion like a wild beast, as Plato describes it. Thrasymachus is a sophist, a professional teacher of rhetoric and argumentation, and he's contemptuous of Socrates' questioning method. He demands that Socrates stop asking questions and give his own definition of justice. When Socrates protests that he's genuinely seeking understanding and doesn't have a definition to offer, Thrasymachus offers his own provocative answer. Justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. This is a pivotal moment in the Republic because Thrasymachus articulates a cynical, realist view of morality that directly challenges the entire project of the dialogue. What does he mean by the advantage of the stronger? He explains, in every city, the ruling power establishes laws that are to its own advantage. Democracy makes democratic laws, tyranny makes tyrannical laws, and so on. These laws define what is just for the citizens, and anyone who breaks them is punished as a lawbreaker and as someone who acts unjustly. Therefore, justice is the same everywhere. It's whatever serves the interest of the established ruling power. The stronger make the rules, and justice is simply obedience to those rules which benefit the rulers. This view has profound implications. If Thrasymachus is right, then justice isn't an objective moral truth, it's just a tool of power. The concept of justice is essentially a con, something the powerful use to control the weak. When ordinary people act justly by following the laws, they're really just serving their master's interests, not their own. From this perspective, the truly rational person would recognize this dynamic and pursue injustice whenever they could get away with it, because acting unjustly means pursuing your own advantage rather than someone else's. Socrates begins his response by seeking clarification. He asks whether Thrasymachus means that justice is whatever the rulers believe to be to their advantage, or what actually is to their advantage. This distinction matters because rulers, being human, can make mistakes. They might pass laws thinking these laws serve their interests when actually the laws harm them. If justice is defined as obedience to the ruler's commands, and the rulers mistakenly command things contrary to their own advantage, then by Thrasymachus's definition, justice would sometimes require acting against the advantage of the stronger, which contradicts his original claim. Thrasymachus tries to dodge this objection by saying that a ruler, insofar as he is truly a ruler and makes no mistakes, always commands what is to his own advantage. This response shifts the discussion into more abstract territory. Socrates then examines what it means to have expertise or craft. Consider a doctor. A doctor, insofar as he is truly a doctor, seeks not his own advantage but the advantage of his patient. That's what the medical art aims at. Similarly, a ship's captain seeks the advantage of the sailors under his care, not his own advantage as such. Every craft or area of expertise is defined by the benefit it provides to its subject matter, not by the benefit to the practitioner. Applying this logic to rulers, Socrates argues that a true ruler, exercising the art of ruling, seeks the advantage of the ruled, not his own advantage. Just as medicine aims at the health of the body, and navigation aims at the safe journey of the ship, political rule aims at the good of the citizens. Therefore, Thrasymachus' definition collapses. Justice cannot be simply the advantage of the stronger if true rulers aim at the advantage of those they rule. Thrasymachus isn't convinced. He shifts his argument, becoming even more provocative. He declares that Socrates is naive about the reality of political life. In actual practice, Thrasymachus insists, the just person always comes out worse than the unjust person. In private contracts, in business dealings, in taxation, everywhere you look, the unjust person gets more and the just person gets less. The unjust person cheats and profits. The just person plays by the rules and suffers. This disparity becomes most obvious in the case of complete injustice. Tyranny. The tyrant commits injustice on a grand scale, seizing property, enslaving people, and yet he's not called a criminal. He's called blessed and happy, both by his own citizens and by everyone else who hears of his complete injustice. This is Thrasymachus's real position. Perfect injustice is more profitable and advantageous than justice. People condemn injustice not because it's truly bad, but because they fear suffering it. Everyone would prefer to commit injustice if they could do so without consequence. Justice is actually a kind of noble foolishness, benefiting others at your own expense, while injustice is good judgment because it gets you what you want. This argument strikes at the heart of morality itself. If Thrasymachus is right, then the entire ethical project is based on a mistake. Virtue isn't actually good for you, it's just a constraint that benefits others. The person who rejects moral constraints and pursues their own advantage through injustice is the truly rational, successful person. It's a deeply unsettling view, and one that Socrates must refute if he's going to defend the value of justice. Socrates offers several responses to Thrasymachus, though Book 1 will end without a fully satisfying resolution. That will come much later in the dialogue. First, Socrates returns to the question of expertise. He argues that injustice isn't actually a form of wisdom or excellence. Consider any area of skill. A skilled musician doesn't try to outdo or exceed another skilled musician in tuning an instrument. They both aim at the same correct tuning. The skilled person tries to outdo the unskilled, but not those who share their expertise. In contrast, an unskilled person might try to outdo everyone, both the skilled and unskilled, because they don't know what the right standard is. Injustice, Socrates suggests, is like this unskilled person. The unjust person tries to outdo everyone, both just and unjust, because they're ignorant of what's truly good. The just person, like the skilled practitioner, aims at what's correct and doesn't seek to exceed other just people. Therefore, justice is allied with wisdom and virtue, while injustice is allied with ignorance and vice. Second, Socrates argues that injustice produces conflict and weakness, while justice produces harmony and strength. Whether in a city, an army, a family, or even a band of thieves, if the group is full of internal conflict and injustice, it cannot act effectively. Even criminals have to maintain some justice among themselves to accomplish their unjust goals. Injustice creates faction and hatred. It makes people unable to cooperate. Justice, on the other hand, creates friendship and unity. Therefore, a group of just people would be more powerful and effective than a group of unjust people. Third, and most importantly for the overall arc of the Republic, Socrates introduces the concept of function. Everything has a function, something it does uniquely or better than anything else. Eyes have the function of seeing, ears of hearing, pruning knives of pruning branches, and with each function comes an excellence or virtue. Good eyes see well, good knives cut well. What is the function of the soul? Socrates suggests it's something like managing, ruling, deliberating, all the activities of living. The excellence or virtue of the soul, therefore, is what allows it to perform these functions well. Justice, Socrates has been arguing, is a virtue of the soul, while injustice is a defect. A just soul will live well and be happy. An unjust soul will live poorly and be miserable. This argument from function will become much more elaborate later in the dialogue, when Socrates develops his detailed psychology and his account of the parts of the soul. For now, though, it serves to counter Thrasymachus's claim. If justice is the virtue that allows the soul to function well, then the just person will necessarily live better than the unjust person, regardless of external circumstances or reputation. Thrasymachus, perhaps exhausted or simply unwilling to continue, agrees to these conclusions, though his agreement seems more like resignation than genuine conviction. The dialogue reaches a provisional stopping point, but Socrates himself acknowledges they haven't really answered the fundamental question. They've talked about whether justice is vice or wisdom, whether it's profitable or unprofitable, but they still don't know what justice actually is. Until they know the nature of justice itself, Socrates says, they can't really determine whether it's a virtue or not, or whether it makes its possessor happy or unhappy. This admission sets up the massive investigation that will occupy the rest of the dialogue. Before we move on, it's worth pausing to appreciate what Book 1 has accomplished. Plato has introduced us to the central question, what is justice and why be just? Through a series of increasingly sophisticated challenges. Cephalus represented the unreflective traditional view. Polemarchus represented a more refined conventional morality. Thrasymachus represented a radical challenge. The idea that justice is merely a construction of the powerful, and that injustice is actually more rational and profitable than justice. Each position has been examined and found wanting, but no positive account has yet been established. We're left in a state of aporia, a Greek term meaning puzzlement or being at a loss. This is deliberate. Plato wants us to feel the weight of these questions, to recognize that our ordinary assumptions about morality might not withstand scrutiny. Only then can we be genuinely open to the philosophical investigation that follows. Book 1 also introduces us to the Socratic method in action, the use of questions, counterexamples, analogies, and logical analysis to test beliefs. We see how definitions that seem perfectly reasonable at first can hide confusions or contradictions. We see how analogies to doctors, ship captains, craftspeople can illuminate ethical questions by drawing parallels to areas where we have clearer intuitions. And we see the importance of distinguishing between appearance and reality, between what seems to be to our advantage and what actually is. Finally, Book 1 establishes the stakes of the discussion. This isn't just an academic exercise. The question of whether justice or injustice makes for a better life is intensely practical. It affects how we should live, what we should value, how we should structure our societies. If Thrasymachus is right that injustice is more profitable, that the tyrant lives the best life, then our entire moral framework needs to be reconsidered. If Socrates is right that justice is a virtue of the soul necessary for living well, then we need to understand justice correctly and order our lives accordingly. These are questions that matter. Book 2, The Challenge Renewed and the Just City begins. Book 2 opens with a development that transforms the dialogue. Thrasymachus has been effectively silenced, but Socrates' victory is incomplete. Glaucon and Adeimantus, who have been present throughout, are not satisfied with Socrates' refutation of Thrasymachus. They don't believe Thrasymachus was right, but they also don't think Socrates has adequately defended justice. They're going to push Socrates much harder, demanding a more thorough and convincing argument. Glaucon begins by distinguishing three kinds of goods. First, there are goods we value purely for their own sake, like harmless pleasures that have no consequences beyond the immediate enjoyment. Second, there are goods we value both for their own sake and for their consequences, like health or knowledge. These are the best kinds of goods. Third, there are goods we value only for their consequences, not for themselves, like medical treatment or exercise, things that are burdensome but beneficial. Glaucon asks Socrates which kind of good is justice. Socrates answers that justice is the finest kind, something valued both for itself and for its consequences. But Glaucon points out that most people don't see it this way. Most people think justice belongs to the burdensome third category, something we practice reluctantly for the sake of reputation and rewards, but which we'd abandon if we could get away with it. Glaucon wants Socrates to prove that justice belongs to the second category, and to do so, he's going to play devil's advocate and present the strongest possible case for injustice. What follows is one of the most famous passages in ancient philosophy. Glaucon presents a sophisticated account of the origin of justice as a social contract. According to this account, committing injustice is naturally good, and suffering injustice is naturally bad. In an ideal world, everyone would want to commit injustice without suffering it themselves. But since people can't guarantee this outcome, since you might commit injustice today but suffer it tomorrow, they make an agreement. They establish laws and social conventions that prohibit injustice. Justice, then, is a compromise. It's not the best outcome, committing injustice without suffering it, but it's better than the worst outcome, suffering injustice without being able to commit it. This social contract view of justice suggests that people are just only because they're forced to be. If there were no laws, no punishments, no social sanctions, people would revert to injustice because that's what's naturally advantageous. To illustrate this claim, Glaucon tells the famous story of the Ring of Gyges. Gyges was a shepherd in service to the king of Lydia. One day after an earthquake, a chasm opened in the earth. Gyges descended into it and found a hollow bronze horse, inside which was a corpse wearing a golden ring. Gyges took the ring and discovered it had magical powers. When he turned the bezel inward, he became invisible. With this power, Gyges seduced the queen, killed the king, and took over the kingdom. The point of the story is this: if anyone, even a just person, possessed a ring of invisibility, would they continue acting justly? Glaucon argues they wouldn't. If you could take whatever you wanted, enter any house, have sex with anyone, kill enemies, free friends from prison, and generally act like a god among humans, all without any chance of being caught, wouldn't you do it? And if you would, doesn't that prove that justice is merely a constraint we accept because we can't escape the consequences of injustice? People aren't just because justice is truly good for them. They're just because injustice is punished. To hammer the point home, Glaucon asks Socrates to compare two lives: the perfectly unjust person who has a reputation for perfect justice, and the perfectly just person who has a reputation for perfect injustice. The unjust person commits every crime, but is so skillful that he's never caught. In fact, everyone thinks he's a paragon of virtue. He enjoys all the rewards of a good reputation, while also enjoying the profits of his crimes. The just person, on the other hand, is truly virtuous but is falsely accused of terrible crimes. He's tortured, imprisoned, and eventually executed, all while maintaining his inner justice. Which life is better? This is a brutal comparison because it strips away all the external rewards associated with justice. If you're just but everyone thinks you're unjust, you get none of the social benefits of justice. No good reputation, no positions of honor, no trust from others. And if you're unjust but everyone thinks you're just, you get all those benefits while also getting the profits of injustice. Glaucon's challenge is for Socrates to show that even in this extreme comparison, the just life is better. Only then will Socrates have proven that justice is valuable for its own sake, not merely for its consequences. Adimantus follows up his brother's challenge with another line of attack. He points out that even people who praise justice usually praise it for its consequences, not for itself. Parents tell children to be just because justice brings rewards, good reputation, political success, favor from the gods. Poets and religious teachers say the gods reward the just with prosperity and punish the unjust with suffering. But all this praise is actually praising the reputation for justice, not justice itself. And if what matters is reputation, then wouldn't the smart person cultivate a reputation for justice while actually being unjust? Why go through the real trouble of being just when all you need is to appear just? Moreover, Adimantus notes, these same poets and teachers also say that the gods can be swayed by prayers and sacrifices. So even if you commit injustice and the gods initially punish you, you can simply offer appropriate sacrifices and be forgiven. The overall calculation seems to favor injustice. Commit injustice, enjoy its profits, maintain a reputation for justice, and if necessary, placate the gods afterward. No one, Adimantus complains, has ever adequately praised justice for what it does to the soul of the person who possesses it, regardless of what gods or humans think. The challenge from Glaucon and Adimantus is therefore much more sophisticated than Thrasymachus's blunt assertion. They are not claiming that injustice is obviously better. They are asking Socrates to prove that justice is better even when stripped of all external rewards. They want an account of what justice is in itself and why it benefits the soul of the just person intrinsically, not instrumentally. Socrates responds with one of the most famous methodological moves in philosophy. He proposes to look for justice writ large in a city before examining it in an individual soul. Justice in a city should be the same in kind as justice in a soul. Just as large letters and small letters are the same letters. By examining justice on the larger, more visible scale of a political community, they should be able to see it more clearly, and then they can look for the same thing in the individual soul. This proposal launches the construction of the city in speech, an imaginary ideal city that will occupy much of the middle books of the Republic. It's important to understand that this city is not a practical political proposal that Plato thinks could or should be implemented. Rather, it's a theoretical model designed to reveal the nature of justice. By seeing what a perfectly just city would look like, we can understand what justice is. Socrates begins with the question, why do cities come into existence at all? His answer is based on need and specialization. No individual is self-sufficient. We need food, shelter, clothing, and many other things. We come together into communities because each of us is better at some things than others, and through cooperation and division of labor, everyone's needs can be met more efficiently. If you're a good farmer but a poor carpenter, and I'm a good carpenter but a poor farmer, we'll both be better off if you focus on farming and I focus on carpentry, and we trade with each other. This economic principle, specialization based on natural aptitude, will turn out to be foundational for Plato's entire theory of justice. Socrates builds up the city starting from the bare necessities: farmers to produce food, builders to construct houses, weavers to make clothing. Then he adds craftspeople of various sorts. He notes that the city will need importers and exporters, which means merchants and sailors. There will need to be a marketplace and a currency for exchange. Already, from these basic economic needs, we have a diverse community with different roles and functions. Glaucon interrupts to say that this city of pigs, as he calls it, seems pretty austere. Where's the sophistication, the culture, the luxuries that make life worth living? Socrates seems initially to suggest that this simple city might be the truly healthy one, but he agrees to examine what happens when we add luxury and sophistication. Once you add these things, the city swells in size. You need artists and entertainers, cooks and confectioners, cosmetics and jewelry. The territory the city occupies is no longer sufficient for its needs, so the city must expand, taking land from neighbors. This leads to war. War necessitates a class of warriors, people specially trained and dedicated to defending the city. Socrates argues that, just as shoemaking or carpentry requires natural aptitude and specialized training, so does warfare. You can't have farmers who fight on the side. You need professional guardians who devote themselves entirely to protecting the city. These guardians must have a unique combination of qualities. They must be spirited and courageous toward enemies, but gentle and philosophical toward their own people. Socrates compares them to noble dogs who are fierce to strangers, but gentle to those they know. This introduces a major theme: the education of the guardians. If the guardians are going to protect the city and potentially rule it, their education is crucial. Socrates turns to the question of what kind of education they should receive. The traditional Greek education involved music and poetry for the soul, and gymnastic for the body. Socrates begins examining the content of the poetry and stories that children, especially future guardians, should be exposed to. This section of Book 2 becomes a critique of traditional Greek mythology. Socrates argues that many traditional stories about the gods are deeply problematic, stories that depict gods fighting each other. Zeus overthrowing Cronus, gods deceiving humans or each other, all these tales present false and harmful images of divinity. If God is truly good, then God cannot be the cause of evil. God must be the cause only of good things. Bad things happen due to other causes. Traditional stories that blame gods for human suffering or depict gods as capricious are therefore false and corrupting. This theological move is important for several reasons. First, it begins the extensive discussion of education that will continue into Book 3. Second, it shows that Plato-Socrates is willing to challenge deeply held cultural and religious traditions in the pursuit of truth and the proper ordering of the soul. Third, it establishes a more philosophical, less anthropomorphic conception of divinity. God, in Plato's view, is perfectly good, unchanging and truthful. Any stories inconsistent with this conception must be rejected. no matter how traditional or beloved they are. Socrates also argues that God cannot change form. Change implies going from better to worse or worse to better, but God, being perfect, cannot become worse, and God, being already perfect, has no reason to become better or different. Therefore, God is unchanging. Stories that depict God's changing shape, Zeus becoming a swan, Proteus transforming, are false, and since God is truthful, God would not create false appearances. Therefore, the poets who tell these stories are lying about divine nature. Before moving to the next section, let's take stock of what Book 2 has accomplished. First, through Glaucon and Adimantus, we've received a much more formidable challenge to justice than Thrasymachus provided. The social contract theory, the ring of Gyges thought experiment, and the comparison between the just person with a bad reputation and the unjust person with a good reputation all force Socrates to defend justice in its purest form, stripped of external rewards. Second, Socrates has proposed his methodology: examine justice in the city before the soul. This will allow him to develop a complex political philosophy that parallels his psychology. Third, we've begun the construction of the just city, starting from economic necessity and specialization, moving through the addition of luxury and the need for guardians, and arriving at the question of education. Fourth, we've seen Socrates' willingness to criticize traditional culture and religion in pursuit of philosophical truth. The stage is now set for a detailed account of education, the structure of the ideal city, and eventually the definition of justice itself. Book 3: Education and the Selection of Rulers. Book 3 continues Socrates' examination of education for the guardians, focusing first on the content of poetry and stories, then on musical modes and rhythms, and finally on the selection and training of the ruling class. This book is crucial because it establishes how the ideal city will produce citizens, especially guardians, who are properly formed in both character and intellect. Socrates extends his critique of traditional poetry beyond theology to stories about heroes and the afterlife. He argues that the guardians cannot be exposed to stories that make death seem terrifying. If future warriors fear death, they'll be ineffective in battle. Therefore, all the passages in Homer and other poets that depict Hades as a terrible, frightening place must be removed or revised. The famous lines about the underworld being so dreadful that one would rather be a slave among the living than a king among the dead. These cannot be part of guardian education. Similarly, stories that show heroes lamenting and wailing excessively must be censored. When Homer depicts Achilles weeping over Patroclus, or Priam groveling before Agamemnon, these passages model behavior inappropriate for guardians. The guardians must learn self-control, moderation, and resilience in the face of suffering. They should view such displays of grief as beneath them, unworthy of good men, especially since such excessive emotion suggests that what happened is genuinely terrible, when in fact, Socrates argues, no earthly misfortune is truly catastrophic for a good person. This might strike modern readers as harsh or even psychologically unhealthy. We value emotional expression and processing grief, but we need to understand what Socrates is trying to accomplish. He's not trying to create emotionless people. He's trying to create people whose emotions are properly ordered by reason. Excessive fear of death or excessive grief over loss indicates that you've placed too much value on bodily life or external possessions, things that can be taken away. The guardian needs to value justice and the good of the soul above everything else, which requires a different emotional orientation than most people have. Socrates continues by arguing that stories depicting gods or heroes laughing uncontrollably are also problematic. Violent laughter involves a loss of self-control, and guardians must be models of self-mastery. Additionally, truthfulness must be emphasized. Socrates makes an interesting qualification here. While lying is generally wrong for ordinary citizens, rulers may need to lie for the benefit of the city, just as doctors sometimes deceive patients for therapeutic reasons. This introduces what will become the controversial notion of the noble lie, which we'll encounter more fully later in Book 3. The content of stories also matters regarding virtue and vice. Poetry must not suggest that unjust people are often happy while just people suffer. It must not depict gods accepting bribes or being swayed by sacrifices to overlook injustice. All such content contradicts the fundamental truths that Socrates is trying to establish, that justice benefits the soul, that the gods are perfectly good, and that virtue is its own reward. After discussing content, Socrates turns to form, specifically the question of imitation or mimesis. Greek poetry was often performed, with the performer speaking in the voice of different characters. Socrates distinguishes between simple narration, where the poet speaks in his own voice, and imitation, where the poet speaks as if he were the character. He argues that guardians should only imitate virtuous people engaged in virtuous actions. They shouldn't imitate women lamenting, slaves cowering, villains plotting, or even craftsmen at work. Why? Because imitation shapes character. When you pretend to be a certain kind of person, you become more like that person. If guardians regularly imitate base or foolish characters, even in play or performance, they'll internalize those traits. This theory of imitation will become central to Plato's later critique of poetry in Book 10, but here it's applied to education. The guardians must be specialists in excellence, and just as you can be both a good tragic actor and a good comic actor simultaneously, specialization again, you can imitate both virtue and vice without compromising your character. Therefore, the guardians will have a very restricted poetic education, exposed only to stories of virtuous people acting virtuously, told in styles that reinforce rather than undermine self-control and rational judgment. Socrates then examines musical modes and rhythms. Different modes in Greek music were associated with different emotional effects. The Mixolydian and Syntylydian modes were considered mournful and soft, appropriate for lamentation. The Ionian and Lydian modes were considered relaxed and convivial, appropriate for drinking parties. Socrates argues that the guardians need only the Dorian and Phrygian modes, the Dorian for courage in war and the Phrygian for temperance in peace. Music that makes people soft, languid, or excessively emotional has no place in the guardian's education. The same principle applies to rhythm. Complex, varied rhythms that don't maintain a steady, orderly beat should be avoided. The guardians need rhythms that express orderliness and courage, rhythms that reinforce rather than undermine rational control. Socrates even extends this analysis to the construction of musical instruments, suggesting that the ideal city won't need complex instruments capable of playing in many modes. Simple lyres and harps will suffice. Why does music matter so much? Socrates explains that rhythm and harmony penetrate deeply into the soul. A person raised on beautiful, orderly music becomes beautiful and orderly in soul. They develop an intuitive sense of what's fine and noble, and they'll recognize and love it when they encounter it in other contexts. Conversely, someone raised on chaotic, disorderly music becomes chaotic and disorderly in soul. Music education, therefore, is not just about aesthetic appreciation. It's about forming the fundamental structure of the soul itself. Before a young person can engage in philosophical reasoning, their character must be properly shaped by the right kind of music and poetry. Socrates next turns to physical education, gymnastics. But even here, the focus isn't primarily on physical strength or athletic achievement. Rather, gymnastics serves the soul, just as music does. The two forms of education work together. Music cultivates the philosophical, gentle side of the soul, while gymnastics cultivates the spirited, courageous side. Too much music without gymnastics makes a person soft and cowardly. Too much gymnastics without music makes a person savage and brutal. The proper balance produces someone who is both courageous and gentle, both physically fit and intellectually refined. Regarding the specifics of physical training, Socrates recommends simplicity in diet and lifestyle. The guardians shouldn't be gourmets or heavy drinkers. They should eat simple, healthy food that keeps them fit for war. Socrates makes a fascinating comparison between the proliferation of doctors and lawyers in a city and the city's moral health. A city that needs lots of doctors because people are constantly sick from overindulgence, or lots of lawyers because people are constantly in disputes, is a sick city. The guardians, through their simple, disciplined lifestyle, will rarely need doctors or lawyers. Having established the education of the guardians, Socrates now addresses a crucial question: who will actually rule the city? Up to this point, he's been talking about guardians generally, those who defend the city. But now he introduces a distinction. From among the guardians, the best must be selected to be the rulers, while the rest will be auxiliaries who enforce the ruler's decisions. This introduces the three-class structure that will define Socrates' ideal city. Rulers, also called guardians in the narrow sense, auxiliaries, also called soldiers or warriors, and the producing class, farmers, craftsmen, merchants. How will the rulers be selected? They must be those who most genuinely care about the city's welfare, who throughout their lives have been eager to do what benefits the city and unwilling to do what harms it. They'll be tested repeatedly from youth through adulthood, tested through pleasures, pains, and fears to see if they maintain their conviction that they must always do what's best for the city. Those who pass all these tests and remain steadfast will be made rulers. Those who fail at any point will remain auxiliaries or drop to the producing class. Here Socrates introduces one of the most controversial elements of the Republic, the noble lie, or myth of the metals. He proposes telling all the citizens a story, a myth that isn't literally true but that serves an important social function. The myth goes like this: all the citizens are brothers, born from the earth itself, but the god who formed them mixed different metals into different people. In the rulers, gold was mixed, in the auxiliaries, silver, and in the producers, bronze and iron. Mostly people will produce offspring like themselves. Gold will beget gold, but occasionally there will be exceptions. A child born to producers might have gold or silver in their nature, and they should be promoted to the guardian or auxiliary class. Conversely, a child of guardians who has bronze or iron in their nature should be demoted to the producing class. The purpose of this myth is to foster social cohesion and acceptance of the social order. If everyone believes they're all born from the same earth, they'll think of each other as family. And if everyone believes that their social position reflects their natural capacities, the metal mixed into them by God, they'll be more willing to accept that position. Those with gold genuinely should rule, because they have the nature for it, not because of birth or wealth or force. Modern readers often find the noble lie deeply troubling. It seems manipulative, even totalitarian. Isn't Plato advocating for a society built on deliberate deception? Several points are worth considering here. First, Plato himself has Socrates express doubt about whether anyone would actually believe this myth, at least in the first generation. He suggests it might take several generations for the myth to become truly established. Second, the myth replaces other false but harmful beliefs, like the belief that social position should be determined by birth alone, or that some families are inherently superior to others. Third, from Plato's perspective, this isn't the most important falsehood in the city. The most important truths are about justice, virtue, and the good life, and those are taught truthfully. The myth of the metals is a noble lie because it serves these higher truths. Nevertheless, the tension remains. Socrates has just spent considerable time arguing that education must be based on truth, that false stories corrupt the soul. Yet here he proposes a foundational myth that is admittedly false. This tension runs throughout the Republic and has generated enormous scholarly debate. Is Plato really advocating for political deception? Is he demonstrating the limits of politics, that even the best city needs some degree of noble deception? Or is he being ironic, showing us the problematic implications of trying to construct a perfect political order? Book 3 concludes with detailed regulations for the guardian class. The guardians will have no private property. They'll live in common barracks, eat together in mess halls, and receive their sustenance from the producing class as payment for their service. They cannot own gold or silver, even to touch it. They cannot have private houses or storerooms. Everything will be held in common. Why such extreme measures? Socrates argues that private property and private families corrupt guardians. If guardians can accumulate wealth, they'll start using their power to enrich themselves rather than to benefit the city. They'll become more like landlords or masters than protectors. They'll turn the other citizens into enemies and slaves rather than fellow citizens. The city will be full of internal conflict, with the guardians fearing plots from those they're supposed to protect. Better that the guardians live simply, focused entirely on their function of ruling and protecting, with no private interest to distract them or corrupt their judgment. This communism of property among the guardians, note that it doesn't apply to the producing class, who can own property and run businesses, is another controversial feature of Plato's ideal city. It seems to demand an almost superhuman selflessness from the ruling class. Can such a system actually work? Would anyone actually accept such conditions? Plato will address these questions more fully in Book 5, when he extends communism beyond property to include wives and children as well. For now, it's important to see how all these elements connect to the central question of justice. The education system, the selection procedures, the communal living arrangements, all are designed to ensure that those who rule genuinely rule for the benefit of the city, not for private advantage. The guardians are being constructed as a class of people whose entire orientation is toward the common good, who have no private interests that might conflict with the city's interests. Whether this is realistic or desirable is a separate question from whether it's coherent as a model of justice, which is what Socrates is trying to establish. Book 3 thus completes the basic structure of the ideal city. 3 classes based on natural aptitude and rigorous selection, with the ruling class educated in music and gymnastics to develop both intellectual and spirited virtues, and living communally to prevent the corruption that private property brings. We now have a city constructed in speech, and we are ready to examine it, to discover where justice resides in it, which will finally allow us to answer Glaucon and Adimantus' challenge about the nature and value of justice. Before moving to Book 4, let's reflect on some broader themes in Book 3. First, there's the central role of education in shaping character and city. Plato doesn't believe that good political institutions alone can produce a good society. You also need good people, and good people are produced through proper education from childhood. This education isn't primarily about acquiring information, it's about shaping the soul, developing proper emotional responses and desires before the person is even capable of philosophical reasoning. The right music, poetry, and physical training create a person who intuitively loves what's truly noble and hates what's base, even before they can articulate why. Second, there's the principle of specialization based on nature. This runs throughout Book 3. Different people have different natural aptitudes, and justice requires that each person perform the function they're naturally suited for. You can't be good at everything, and attempting to do tasks you're not suited for produces inferior results. This principle will turn out to be central to Plato's definition of justice itself. Third, there's the tension between truth and utility, especially regarding the noble lie. Plato clearly values truth. He spent extensive time arguing that education must be based on truth, that false stories about gods corrupt the soul. Yet he also recognizes that political stability might require certain useful fictions. This creates a philosophical problem. If truth is so important, how can any lie be noble? This question points to deeper issues about the relationship between philosophy and politics, knowledge and opinion, the ideal and the practical. Fourth, there's the radical proposal that rulers should have no private property. This challenges fundamental assumptions about human motivation. Most people assume that you need private incentives, the ability to enrich yourself, to motivate good performance. Plato is arguing the opposite. Private incentives corrupt public roles. The only way to get rulers who genuinely rule for the common good is to ensure they have no private good that might conflict with the common good. Whether this is psychologically realistic is debatable, but it's philosophically coherent. If someone's self-interest is perfectly aligned with the community's interest because they have no private interests, then their ruling in their own interest means ruling in the community's interest. Book 4. The Discovery of Justice. Book 4 begins with an objection from Adimantus. He points out that the guardians don't seem particularly happy in this city. They rule but own nothing. They don't have comfortable houses or fine possessions or any of the things that typically make rulers' lives pleasant. They're more like hired soldiers than happy rulers. How can this be the ideal city if the people running it aren't even happy? This objection gives Socrates an opportunity to clarify the goal of the city's construction. He reminds Adimantus that they're not trying to make one class especially happy at the expense of others. Rather, they're trying to make the whole city as happy as possible. It's not a problem if the guardians aren't exceptionally happy as individuals, so long as the city as a whole flourishes. In fact, making the guardians wealthy and comfortable would undermine the city's overall happiness by corrupting the guardians and creating internal conflict. Socrates uses the analogy of painting a statue. You shouldn't paint the eyes the most beautiful color in isolation, say purple, if that makes the overall statue less beautiful. The eyes should be painted the color that makes them look like eyes and contributes to the beauty of the whole statue. Similarly, each class in the city should be arranged not to maximize its own isolated happiness, but to contribute to the overall excellence and happiness of the city. This response introduces an important principle: the priority of the whole over the parts. For Plato, the fundamental unit of analysis isn't the individual, but the community, or by analogy, the organized whole. A good city isn't one where each individual maximizes their personal satisfaction. It's one where the different elements are properly arranged in relation to each other, creating a harmonious and well-functioning whole. Individual happiness follows from playing your proper role in a well-ordered whole, not from maximizing your private advantage. Socrates continues by discussing other threats to the city's unity and excellence. The guardians must prevent both poverty and wealth among the producing class. Poverty makes craftsmen unable to afford proper tools and leads to inferior products and lazy workers. Wealth makes craftsmen soft, luxurious, and unwilling to work. Either extreme undermines the city. The guardians must also ensure the city doesn't grow too large. It should be as large as possible while maintaining unity, but no larger. A city so large that it loses its cohesion becomes multiple cities rather than one city. The guardians must also rigorously enforce the educational system and the principle of promoting and demoting citizens based on their actual nature rather than their birth. This is what the myth of the metals was meant to ensure, that people with golden natures rule regardless of who their parents are, and people with bronze natures work as producers regardless of their parentage. Adimantus asks whether they need to legislate in detail about all the various social matters: commercial contracts, market regulations, taxes, penalties for assault and insult, and so on. Socrates dismisses this. If the fundamental education and structure of the city are right, the citizens will figure out these details for themselves. If the fundamental education and structure are wrong, no amount of detailed legislation will fix the city. It's like a sick person who refuses to change their lifestyle but keeps looking for new medical treatments. You'll never cure them because you're not addressing the root cause. Good education produces people who will naturally develop good laws and customs. Bad education produces people who will corrupt even good laws. Having completed the basic construction of the city in speech, Socrates now proposes to search for justice within it. He suggests that if the city has been correctly constructed, it should possess all the cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. By identifying the first three, they should be able to see what's left over, and that will be justice. Wisdom in the city is easy to identify. It resides in the rulers, specifically in their knowledge of what's good for the city as a whole. Not every kind of knowledge makes a city wise. Carpentry knowledge makes the city good at carpentry, but it doesn't make the city wise. Wisdom is the specific knowledge of how to govern well, how to make good decisions for the whole city, and this knowledge belongs to the smallest class, the rulers. So the city is wise because of the wisdom of its ruling class. Courage is also fairly straightforward. The city is courageous through its military class, the auxiliaries. But what exactly is courage? Socrates defines it as the preservation of correct opinion about what's truly to be feared and what's not, even in the face of pain, pleasure, desire, and fear. The education system has instilled in the auxiliaries a correct understanding of what's genuinely dangerous, namely injustice and dishonor, and what's not genuinely dangerous, bodily harm or death. Courage is maintaining this understanding even when faced with the temptation to abandon it. Socrates compares this to dyeing wool. If you want a color to be permanent, you first prepare the wool by cleaning it thoroughly, then apply the dye, which will be permanent and won't wash out. Similarly, the education system prepares the auxiliaries' souls, and then the correct opinions about honor and fear are dyed into them so deeply that no amount of pleasure or pain can wash them out. This is true courage, as opposed to the courage of animals or uneducated people, which is really just fearlessness based on ignorance. Moderation is more complex. Unlike wisdom and courage, which reside in particular classes, moderation pervades the entire city. It's a kind of harmony and agreement among all the classes about who should rule. The rulers, auxiliaries, and producers all agree that the rational element, embodied in the ruling class, should govern, and the other elements should willingly obey. This willing agreement and harmony is moderation. It's not just the rulers being moderate, or just the producers being moderate. It's all the classes accepting their proper roles and working together harmoniously. Now comes the crucial moment. What is justice? Socrates suggests that justice has been present in their discussion all along. In fact, it was one of the founding principles of the city. Remember when they said each person should do the one job they're naturally suited for? That principle, each person doing their own work and not meddling in the work of others, is justice. More specifically, justice in the city consists in each of the three classes doing its own work and not interfering with the others. The producers must produce, the auxiliaries must defend and enforce, and the rulers must rule. When each class minds its own business and performs its proper function, the city is just. Injustice is the opposite, when classes meddle with each other's roles, when producers try to rule or auxiliaries engage in commerce rather than defense, or rulers concern themselves with making money rather than governing wisely. This might seem like an underwhelming definition after all the build-up. Justice is just everyone doing their own job, but we need to see the depth of what Socrates is claiming. He's not saying justice is merely occupational specialization. He's saying that justice is a proper ordering of elements where each part contributes its specific excellence to the well-functioning of the whole. In the city, this means the wisdom of the rulers guides policy, the courage of the auxiliaries protects and enforces that policy, and the productivity of the workers provides the material basis for the city's existence. No class tries to usurp the function of another. Each recognizes the value and necessity of the others. All work together in harmony. Why is this justice rather than just efficiency? Because it embodies a fundamental moral principle, that there's a natural order in which wisdom should govern, spirit should protect, and appetite should be disciplined. When this order is maintained, human life flourishes. When it's violated, when appetite governs, or when spirit rules without wisdom, human life deteriorates into chaos and conflict. Having found justice in the city, Socrates now turns to the soul. If the city-soul analogy holds, then the soul should have three parts, corresponding to the three classes of the city, and justice in the soul should consist in proper ordering of those three parts. This psychological theory will be one of Plato's most influential contributions to Western thought. Socrates argues that the soul must have parts because we experience internal conflict. Sometimes we desire something, food, drink, sex, but simultaneously refuse that desire because we judge it inappropriate or harmful. This conflict can't be between the same thing and itself in the same respect. Therefore, the soul must have at least two parts, one that desires and one that reasons and sometimes opposes those desires. Socrates distinguishes three parts. First, there's the rational part, the part that calculates, reasons, and considers what's truly good. Second, there's the appetitive part, the part that desires food, drink, sex, and other bodily pleasures. Third, and this requires more argument, there's the spirited part, which is the source of anger, indignation, and the desire for honor and recognition. To demonstrate that spirit is distinct from both reason and appetite, Socrates tells the story of Leontius. Leontius was walking near the public execution ground and saw corpses lying there. He felt a desire to look at them, but was simultaneously disgusted with himself for having this desire. He struggled with himself, trying to resist, but finally the desire overcame him. He rushed to the corpses, opened his eyes wide, and said to them, "There you are, you wretches. Feast yourselves on this beautiful sight." This story illustrates internal conflict, but not just between reason and appetite. Leontius's anger is directed at his own appetites. He's angry with himself for having a morbid desire. This anger, this indignation at his own weakness, comes from the spirited part of the soul. Spirit naturally allies with reason against appetite, getting angry when appetite refuses to obey reason. But spirit is distinct from reason. It's the emotional, passionate part that values honor, hates shame, and feels indignation at injustice. We see this spirited part especially in children before they develop reason. Young children are full of spirit. They get angry, they want recognition, they have a strong sense of pride, but they don't yet have developed rational capacities. This shows that spirit is independent of reason, even though in a well-ordered soul it serves reason. So the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. And just as the city has virtues corresponding to its parts, so does the soul. The soul is wise when reason knows what's truly good and guides the whole person toward it. The soul is courageous when spirit maintains correct judgments about what's to be feared, supporting reason even in the face of pain or temptation. The soul is moderate when all three parts agree that reason should rule, when spirit and appetite willingly accept the governance of reason. And the soul is just when each part does its own work. Reason should rule, using its knowledge of what's truly good. Spirit should support reason, providing the emotional energy and courage to act on reason's judgments. Appetite should be disciplined by reason and spirit, pursuing bodily pleasures only in moderation and only when reason judges it appropriate. When these three parts are properly ordered, with each doing its job and not usurping the role of another, the soul is just and the person is just. Injustice in the soul is the opposite, when the parts rebel against their proper order. If appetite rebels and tries to rule, the person becomes enslaved to bodily desires, unable to resist immediate gratification even when reason knows it's harmful. If spirit rebels and dominates reason, the person becomes governed by anger and the desire for honor, acting on passion rather than judgment. In either case, the soul is in civil war with itself, pulled in different directions, unable to function as an integrated whole. This psychological theory allows Socrates to finally answer Glaucon and Adimantus's challenge. Is justice profitable? Is it better to be just than unjust? Now we can see the answer. Justice is the health of the soul. An unjust soul is a sick soul, torn by internal conflict, with its parts fighting each other rather than working together. Would you choose bodily sickness for any amount of money or power? Of course not. Bodily health is more valuable than external goods. Similarly, psychic health, justice, is more valuable than any external goods. The unjust person, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has a sick soul. The just person, even if poor or enslaved, has a healthy soul. The analogy to health is crucial. You don't ask whether health is profitable. Health is what profit is for. You don't pursue health for the sake of something else. You pursue other things to maintain health. Similarly, justice isn't profitable in the sense that it gets you other goods. Rather, other goods are valuable only insofar as they contribute to justice. The question, why be just, is like asking, why be healthy? The answer is that justice health is the proper functioning of the soul body. It's what makes you capable of living well at all. Moreover, the unjust person can't actually enjoy even the external goods they acquire through injustice, because their soul is in chaos. Imagine someone whose appetites rule their soul. They may acquire wealth, but they'll squander it on pleasures that never satisfy. They may gain power, but they'll use it impulsively, creating enemies and living in fear. They may have opportunities for deep relationships, but their inability to control their desires will destroy those relationships. The unjust soul, being disordered, can't make good use of anything. In contrast, the just person whose soul is properly ordered can make good use of even limited resources. Their reason guides them toward what's truly valuable. Their spirit gives them the strength to pursue difficult goods. Their appetites are satisfied in moderation, providing pleasure without domination. Such a person lives well regardless of external circumstances, not because they're indifferent to externals, but because their internal order allows them to respond to circumstances with wisdom rather than being controlled by them. Book 4 ends with Socrates proposing to examine various forms of injustice in souls and cities. He suggests there's one form of virtue but many forms of vice, and he wants to explore these vicious constitutions and souls to show more fully why justice is preferable. However, this examination will be postponed because Polemarchus and Adimantus interrupt with questions about the guardians' living arrangements, particularly regarding women and children, which launches the controversial discussions of Book 5. Before moving forward, let's appreciate what Book 4 has accomplished. First, it's provided a definition of justice in the city, each class doing its own work, in the soul, each part doing its own work. This definition makes justice a matter of proper order and harmony rather than a specific set of rules or actions. Second, it's introduced a psychological theory that will be enormously influential: the tripartite soul with reason, spirit, and appetite as distinct sources of motivation. Third, it's answered the central challenge of the dialogue: why be just? Justice is psychic health, the proper functioning of the soul, and therefore is valuable in itself regardless of external rewards. Fourth, it's drawn a close analogy between city and soul, suggesting that political justice and individual justice are the same in kind, both involving the proper ordering of parts under the rule of reason. This account of justice has both strengths and challenges. Its strength is that it makes justice internal and intrinsic rather than external and instrumental. You can't fake justice. You either have a well-ordered soul or you don't. And if you have a well-ordered soul, you genuinely are better off, regardless of reputation or rewards. The challenge is whether this account matches our ordinary understanding of justice. When we talk about just actions or just laws, we usually mean something about fairness, equality, or rights, not primarily about psychic harmony. Plato seems to be offering a revisionary account of justice, redefining it in terms of his psychological and political theory. Whether this redefinition is illuminating or misleading has been debated for 2 millennia and continues to be debated today. Book 5: Women, Children, and Philosopher-Kings. Book 5 represents one of the most dramatic turning points in the Republic. Just as Socrates is about to move on to examine defective constitutions, Polemarchus and Adimantus demand that he return to something he mentioned briefly earlier: the arrangements regarding women and children among the guardians. Socrates had said these would be held in common, but he hadn't explained what that meant or how it would work. The group insists he can't proceed without fully explaining these controversial proposals. Socrates is reluctant, sensing that what he's about to say will provoke criticism and disbelief. He describes himself as hesitating before a wave of criticism. And indeed, Book 5 contains 3 successive waves of increasingly radical proposals. The first wave concerns women, the second concerns children and the family, and the third, the largest wave, concerns philosopher-kings. Each proposal is more shocking than the last, and together they represent Plato's most utopian and controversial political ideas. The first wave addresses the role of women in the guardian class. Socrates argues that women should receive the same education as men and should perform the same functions, including warfare and ruling. This was an astonishingly radical proposal in ancient Athens, where women were largely confined to domestic roles and excluded from political and military life. Socrates' argument proceeds from his principle of specialization based on nature. He asks, what relevant natural difference exists between men and women that would justify giving them different educations and different roles? The obvious answer is that men beget and women bear children. But Socrates points out that this biological difference doesn't determine aptitude for any particular craft or profession. A male and female doctor both practice medicine equally well. The man's ability to beget children doesn't make him a better doctor. Similarly, with carpentry, music, or any other skill, biological sex doesn't determine professional aptitude. Someone might object that men are generally stronger than women. Socrates grants this, but asks whether it's relevant. Yes, men on average may be stronger, but strength comes in degrees. Some women are stronger than some men. More importantly, for any given aptitude or talent, whether it's philosophy, music, medicine, or warfare, you'll find both men and women with that aptitude. Some women have natural philosophical ability, some men don't. Some women have natural military ability, some men don't. If we're assigning roles based on natural aptitude, as justice requires, then we must give men and women with the same aptitudes the same education, and the same roles. This leads to a provocative implication. Female guardians will exercise naked in the gymnasium alongside male guardians, just as male guardians exercise naked together. Socrates anticipates that people will find this laughable or shocking. He notes that the Greeks once thought it ridiculous for men to exercise naked, but they got used to it and recognized its practical benefits. Similarly, people may initially laugh at women exercising and training for war alongside men, but if it's truly better, if it produces better guardians and a better city, then custom must yield to truth. The argument here is characteristically Platonic. Don't be guided by convention or by what seems ridiculous according to current customs. Be guided by reason and evidence. If women can perform the same functions as men, and Socrates argues they can, at least some women can, then justice requires giving them the same opportunities. Otherwise, you're wasting natural talent and violating the principle that each person should do what they're naturally suited for. Modern readers might want to claim Plato as an early feminist, but we should be careful. Socrates isn't arguing for gender equality out of a belief in equal rights or human dignity. He's arguing from functional efficiency. The city needs the best guardians possible, and if some women can be excellent guardians, it's wasteful not to use them. Additionally, Plato still assumes on average that men will be better at most tasks than women. His point is just that this average difference doesn't justify excluding all women from guardian roles. So while Plato's conclusion is remarkably progressive for his time, his reasoning is more utilitarian than principled in the modern sense. The second wave is even more radical: the abolition of the private family among the guardians. Socrates proposes that the guardians will not have private marriages or private children. Instead, the rulers will arrange temporary sexual unions designed to produce the best offspring. Women and men at their physical prime will be brought together for reproductive purposes, with the best men matched with the best women as often as possible, and inferior matches made rarely. The goal is eugenic, to breed the best possible guardians. The children born from these unions will be taken immediately at birth and raised communally. No parent will know which child is theirs, and no child will know their biological parents. All the guardians of one generation will regard all the children of the next generation as their sons and daughters, and all the children will regard all the adults as their parents. The biological fact of parentage will be hidden and will have no social significance. Why such a radical arrangement? Socrates offers several justifications. First, it prevents the corruption that comes from private family loyalties. If a guardian has his own wife and children, he'll be tempted to use his power to benefit them specifically, even at the expense of the city. He'll want to accumulate wealth to pass on to his children, secure positions of power for his sons, arrange advantageous marriages for his daughters. All of this creates private interests that conflict with devotion to the common good. By eliminating private families, you eliminate these corrupting incentives. Second, and relatedly, eliminating private families creates maximum unity in the city. Socrates argues that the greatest good for a city is unity. When all citizens share pleasures and pains, when what benefits one benefits all, and what harms one harms all. Private families fragment this unity. You care intensely about your own family but are indifferent to others. Your family's success is your joy even if it comes at another family's expense. But if all the guardians are one extended family, then everyone's success is everyone's joy, and everyone's suffering is everyone's concern. The city becomes as unified as a single organism, where the whole body feels pain if the finger is injured. Third, the eugenic breeding program will produce better guardians. Just as we carefully breed dogs and horses to get the best traits, we should carefully manage human reproduction to get the best people. The best guardians should have the most children, inferior guardians should have few or none. Over time, this will improve the guardian class's overall quality. Socrates even suggests that the rulers will need to employ noble lies to implement this system, using rigged lotteries to make it seem like chance determines who mates with whom, when actually the rulers are carefully controlling reproduction. These proposals horrified many of Plato's ancient readers and continue to horrify modern ones. The abolition of the family seems to destroy one of the most fundamental human relationships and sources of meaning. The eugenic breeding program seems to reduce human reproduction to animal husbandry, ignoring love, choice, and human dignity. The deception involved in the rigged lotteries seems deeply manipulative, and the entire system seems totalitarian in its subordination of individual life to state control. Several responses are possible. Some scholars argue that Plato is being deliberately provocative, showing us the logical extreme of collectivism to make us question whether we really want political unity above all else. Others argue that Plato is serious, but that we should understand these proposals in their philosophical context. He's constructing an ideal city to reveal the nature of justice, not necessarily proposing a practical political program. Still others defend aspects of Plato's proposals, arguing that the private family really does create problematic conflicts of interest, and that some subordination of private to public interest is necessary for a just society. Whatever we make of these proposals, it's important to note their limited scope. Socrates is only proposing abolition of private marriage and family for the guardian class, the rulers and auxiliaries. The producing class will still have traditional families, private property, and normal lives. This makes sense given his logic. The producers don't have political power, so their family loyalties can't corrupt government. Only those with power need to be freed from private attachments that might corrupt their exercise of that power. After presenting these radical proposals about women and family, Socrates turns to the question of whether such a city could actually exist. This leads to the third and largest wave, the proposal that philosophers must become kings, or kings must become philosophers. Until this happens, Socrates declares, there will be no rest from evils for cities or for the human race. This is perhaps the most famous claim in the Republic, and it requires careful unpacking. What does Socrates mean by philosopher? He doesn't just mean someone who has studied philosophy or who is clever at argument. He means someone who has genuine knowledge of truth, particularly knowledge of the forms, those eternal, unchanging realities that are the true objects of knowledge. The philosopher is someone who loves and seeks wisdom, who has turned away from the shifting appearances of the sensible world and grasped the permanent realities that underlie those appearances. Why must philosophers rule? Because only philosophers have knowledge of what's truly good. Everyone else has mere opinion, belief that might be true or false but isn't grounded in genuine understanding. If you want a city governed well, you need rulers who know what's truly good for the city, not rulers who merely believe certain things are good or who are swayed by popular opinion. Just as you'd want a doctor who knows medicine to treat your illness rather than someone with opinions about medicine, you should want a philosopher who knows the good to govern your city rather than someone with opinions about politics. This proposal immediately raises the question, what is this knowledge that philosophers possess? What are these forms that they grasp? Socrates begins to explain by distinguishing knowledge from opinion. Knowledge is always of what is, of being, of reality, of truth. Opinion is of what both is and is not, of appearance, of what seems but might not be. For example, consider beauty. Beautiful things, a beautiful painting, a beautiful person, a beautiful sunset, are both beautiful and not beautiful. They're beautiful in some respects or to some people, but not beautiful in others. They're beautiful at one time, but not at another. No particular beautiful thing is simply, perfectly, always beautiful. But there must be something that is simply, perfectly, always beautiful. Beauty itself, the form of beauty. This form is what all beautiful things share in, what makes them beautiful to the extent that they are beautiful. The form doesn't change, doesn't vary with perspective or time. It's eternally and perfectly beautiful, and the same applies to every quality. Justice itself, courage itself, goodness itself. These forms are the eternal, unchanging realities that particular just actions, courageous people, and good things imperfectly resemble. Most people never grasp these forms. They see beautiful things but don't conceive of beauty itself. They experience just actions but don't understand justice itself. They live in the realm of opinion, believing that the particular beautiful or just things they've encountered are the whole of beauty or justice. The philosopher, through rigorous intellectual training, comes to understand the forms themselves, the true realities of which sensible particulars are merely shadows or reflections. This theory of forms is one of Plato's most distinctive and influential philosophical contributions. It provides a metaphysical foundation for objective truth and value. If there are forms, eternal perfect standards, then there are objective truths about beauty, justice, and goodness that don't depend on human opinion or convention. Against sophists like Thrasymachus, who argue that justice is merely what the powerful say it is, Plato asserts that justice itself exists independently, and that we can know it, even if most people don't. The political implication is clear. Only philosophers who grasp the form should rule, because only they know what justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom truly are. Other rulers might mean well, but they're operating on opinion, not knowledge. They're like blind guides leading the blind. The philosopher-king, having seen the form of the good itself, can guide the city toward genuine goodness, rather than toward what merely seems good. But here's a problem. Most philosophers have no interest in ruling. They'd rather contemplate truth than deal with the messy, contentious business of politics. And most cities would never accept a philosopher as ruler. People who are used to sophists and rhetoricians, people who tell them what they want to hear, will be hostile to a philosopher who tells them uncomfortable truths. So how can philosopher-kings ever come to be? Socrates offers two possible scenarios. First, by some divine chance, a philosopher might be born into a royal family and inherit political power. If such a person receives proper philosophical education and doesn't become corrupted by power, they might rule as a philosopher-king. Alternatively, a philosopher might, through extraordinary circumstances, be forced to take control of a city, perhaps during a crisis when conventional politicians have failed. In either case, if one true philosopher gained power, they could implement the educational system and political structure that would produce more philosopher rulers, making the system self-sustaining. Socrates admits these scenarios are unlikely. He's not claiming that the ideal city will definitely come into existence, or even that it probably will. His claim is more modest. It's possible in principle. There's no logical or natural law that prevents it. And even if it never exists in reality, the ideal city serves as a model, a standard we can use to evaluate actual cities and to guide reform. We can make cities better or worse, depending on whether they approximate or diverge from the ideal. This introduces an important distinction between ideal theory and practical politics. Socrates is engaged in ideal theory, constructing a model of perfect justice to understand what justice is. He's not primarily engaged in practical politics, advising on how to improve existing cities given realistic constraints. The ideal city might be unrealizable, but that doesn't make it useless. It shows us what we should aim at, what perfection looks like, even if we can never fully achieve it. To further explain why philosophers should rule, Socrates contrasts the philosophical and the political life. Most people who enter politics do so from appetite, desire for wealth, power, or honor. They see political office as a prize to be won, a source of personal benefit. But the true philosopher has no such desires. Through their study of the forms, they've come to value wisdom above all else. Wealth, power, and honor seem trivial compared to contemplating eternal truth. This creates a paradox. The people who would rule best don't want to rule, and the people who want to rule would rule badly. The solution is compulsion. The ideal city must compel the philosophers to rule. After they've received their education, studied mathematics and dialectic, and finally grasped the form of the good, they must be forced to return to the cave, that is, to descend from contemplation back to politics, and use their knowledge to govern the city. Why should philosophers accept this compulsion? Because they owe a debt to the city. The city nurtured them, educated them, made their philosophical development possible. Unlike naturally gifted people in corrupt cities who manage to philosophize despite their education, the philosophers in the ideal city achieved their wisdom because of the city's excellent educational system. Therefore, they have an obligation to use their wisdom to benefit the city. They must take turns ruling, spending part of their lives in political administration and part in philosophical study. This arrangement ensures that the city is ruled by people who do not want power for its own sake, the only people who can be trusted with power. Someone who hungers for political office will abuse it to satisfy their hunger. Someone who values philosophy more than politics will rule well because they're not ruling for personal advantage. They're ruling out of duty, and they'll be happy to return to philosophy once their term of service is complete. Book 5 thus presents a complete, if radical, vision of the ideal state. Women with appropriate natural abilities will be educated and serve as guardians. Private families among the guardians will be abolished. with children raised communally and reproduction managed eugenically. And philosopher-kings who have grasped the form of the good will rule, not out of desire for power but out of duty to the city that educated them. These three waves, gender equality among guardians, abolition of the family, and philosopher-kings, are interconnected. Each follows from the fundamental principle: the city should be organized to produce the best possible government, and that requires eliminating private interests that corrupt rulers and ensuring that rulers have genuine knowledge of the good. Before moving to Book 6, we should consider the deeper philosophical issues these proposals raise. First, there's the question of whether unity is really the highest political good. Socrates assumes that the more unified a city is, the better. But Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, later argued against this. Aristotle claimed that a city is naturally a plurality, made up of diverse people with diverse interests and talents. Trying to make it completely unified would destroy what makes it a city. Some diversity and some tension between private and public interests might be necessary and even beneficial. Plato's assumption that maximum unity equals maximum goodness is contestable. Second, there's the question of whether knowledge of the good really translates into good governance. Even if philosophers grasp the form of the good, does that make them skilled at practical politics? Knowing the good in the abstract might be different from knowing how to implement it in concrete, messy situations involving imperfect people and competing interests. Technical knowledge of the forms might not translate into practical wisdom about how to govern actual cities. Third, there's a deep tension in Plato's position about philosophers and politics. On the one hand, he's arguing that philosophers should rule. On the other hand, he's acknowledging that philosophers don't want to rule and that philosophy is a higher activity than politics. This suggests that politics is a necessary evil, something that must be done but isn't intrinsically valuable. Yet Plato has also suggested that the city is the context in which human excellence is realized, and that serving the city is noble. There's an unresolved tension between the philosophical life and the political life, between contemplation and action, that runs throughout the dialogue. Fourth, there's the question of feasibility. Even if we grant that philosopher-kings would govern well, is it realistic to think such a system could be established or maintained? How do you ensure that philosophers receive proper education without already having philosopher-kings to design that education? How do you prevent the system from degenerating over time? Something Plato himself will discuss in Books 8 and 9. The ideal city might be possible in principle, but the path from existing corrupt cities to the ideal seems impossibly difficult. Finally, there's the question of desirability. Even if the ideal city could exist, should we want it to? Many readers find Plato's vision oppressive. The breeding programs, the noble lies, the compulsory education, the abolition of family, all seem to treat human beings as means to the city, as ends rather than as ends in themselves. The individual seems to have no space for private life, personal choice, or individual flourishing apart from their assigned role in the city. Is this really a vision of justice, or is it a vision of totalitarian control? These questions have animated debate about the Republic for over 2 millennia. Some readers see Plato as offering a genuine political ideal, however difficult to realize. Others see him as exposing the problematic implications of taking political idealism too far. Still others see the dialogue as deliberately ambiguous, using Socrates as a character to explore questions rather than to deliver Plato's final answers. Whatever interpretation we adopt, Book 5 represents the climax of the political construction, the point at which the ideal city is fully specified, for better or worse. Book 6, the nature of philosophy and the form of the good. Book 6 continues the discussion of philosopher-kings by examining more carefully what philosophy is and why philosophers are qualified to rule. The book also introduces one of the most famous images in Western philosophy, the analogy of the sun, which illuminates Plato's conception of the form of the good. The book begins by addressing an obvious objection to philosopher-kings. Most people who study philosophy seem useless or even vicious. How can Socrates claim philosophers should rule when actual philosophers are either impractical dreamers or sophistic frauds? This objection forces Socrates to distinguish true philosophers from those who merely seem to be philosophers, and to explain why philosophy has gained a bad reputation. Socrates responds with the famous image of the ship of state. Imagine a ship whose owner is bigger and stronger than everyone else on board, but somewhat deaf and short-sighted. The sailors are quarreling about who should navigate, though none of them has learned the art of navigation. They don't even believe navigation is something that can be taught. They think it's just a matter of seizing control. They spend their time flattering the owner, trying to get him to give them the helm. Meanwhile, the true navigator, who studies the stars and seasons and winds, is called a useless stargazer by the sailors. This image represents democracy, or at least democratic politics, as Plato sees it. The owner is the people, who have ultimate power but lack knowledge. The quarreling sailors are politicians and sophists, who compete for power through rhetoric and flattery rather than through knowledge. The true navigator is the philosopher, who possesses actual knowledge of how to steer the city, but is scorned as impractical because he doesn't engage in the power struggles that ordinary politics requires. The point is that philosophers seem useless only in corrupt political systems where power goes to those who are good at flattery and manipulation rather than to those with genuine knowledge. It's not that philosophy is useless, it's that corrupt cities don't use philosophy. If cities were properly ordered, with power given to those with knowledge, philosophers would be recognized as supremely useful. The problem isn't with philosophy but with existing political arrangements. What about the vicious philosophers, the sophists and others who use philosophical skills for bad ends? Socrates argues these aren't really philosophers at all. True philosophy is love of wisdom, love of truth for its own sake. The sophists don't love truth. They love money or power or victory in argument. They've learned some philosophical techniques, argumentation, rhetoric, conceptual analysis, but they use these tools for the wrong ends. They're corrupted philosophers, not true philosophers. How does this corruption happen? Socrates offers a psychological account. Someone with natural philosophical ability, intelligence, good memory, courage, nobility of character, is rare and valuable. If such a person grows up in a corrupt city, everyone will try to use them for their own purposes. Politicians will flatter them and try to recruit them. Their family will pressure them to enter politics or business to bring honor and wealth to the household. Their fellow citizens will praise them when they conform to popular opinion and criticize them when they don't. Under this intense social pressure, most naturally philosophical people are corrupted. They learn to use their considerable talents to achieve power, wealth, and honor rather than wisdom. They become lawyers, politicians, or sophists, using philosophical skills instrumentally rather than valuing wisdom intrinsically. Only very few people, through extraordinary circumstances, perhaps a naturally philosophical temperament so strong it resists corruption, or exile from political life due to illness or foreign birth, manage to pursue genuine philosophy in corrupt cities. This analysis explains why philosophy has a bad reputation. The most talented people become corrupted and practice false philosophy, sophistry in various forms. Meanwhile, people with mediocre abilities see that philosophy is prestigious and try to practice it without real aptitude, producing bad philosophy. True philosophers are rare exceptions, and they're often scorned by corrupt cities as impractical or dangerous. No wonder philosophy seems useless or vicious to most people. The solution is to create a city where naturally philosophical people receive proper education and are protected from corrupting influences. In the ideal city, philosophically gifted children would be identified early, educated in mathematics and dialectic, and gradually led toward knowledge of the forms. They wouldn't be exposed to positions of power until their character is formed and their knowledge established. This would produce true philosophers, people with both natural ability and proper education, who could then rule wisely. Having defended philosophy against common criticisms, Socrates now needs to explain more carefully what philosophers know that qualifies them to rule. This leads to extended discussion of the forms and, ultimately, the form of the good, the highest object of knowledge and the source of all value and truth. Socrates begins by describing the philosopher's distinctive traits. The philosopher loves learning and truth. They desire to understand reality, not just to accumulate opinions. They're temperate because they don't value bodily pleasures highly compared to intellectual pleasures. They're courageous because they don't fear death. Their souls are oriented toward eternal truth, so bodily death seems less significant. They're just because their souls are properly ordered by their love of wisdom. They're gentle and civilized because they spend time contemplating orderly, eternal realities and become orderly themselves. They're not petty or small-minded because their thoughts encompass all time and all being. This portrait of the philosopher emphasizes how study of the forms transforms character. You become like what you contemplate. If you spend your time thinking about money, you become greedy. If you focus on bodily pleasures, you become intemperate. If you contemplate eternal truth, beauty, and goodness, you become wise, beautiful in soul, and good. The philosopher's character is a reflection of the realities they study. But what exactly is the form of the good that the philosopher must grasp? Socrates approaches this question with unusual hesitancy. He says he can't give a direct account of the good itself. That would require knowledge he doesn't possess. Instead, he'll offer an analogy: the sun. Just as the sun in the visible realm is the source of light and vision, the form of the good in the intelligible realm is the source of truth and knowledge. Here's how the analogy works. Consider vision. Eyes have the capacity to see, and objects have the capacity to be seen. But actual seeing requires a third thing: light. The sun provides light, making vision possible. Without sunlight, eyes and objects would both exist, but no seeing would occur. Moreover, the sun doesn't just enable vision, it's also the cause of growth and life. Plants need sunlight to grow, animals need plants for food, and so the entire living world depends on the sun, even though the sun itself isn't a living thing. Now transfer this to the intelligible realm. The mind has the capacity to know, and the forms have the capacity to be known. But actual knowing requires a third thing: the form of the good. Just as the sun provides light that makes vision possible, the good provides truth and reality that make knowledge possible. When the mind grasps the form of the good, it can then understand other forms in relation to the good. Without grasping the good, you might have opinions about various things, but you wouldn't have genuine knowledge. Moreover, just as the sun is the cause of life and growth, the good is the cause of being and truth for the forms. The other forms, justice, beauty, courage, and so on, derive their reality and value from their relation to the good. The good is beyond being in dignity and power, as Socrates puts it, which provokes laughter from Glaucon at the extravagant claim. But the point is serious. The good isn't just another form among forms, it's the source and ground of all other forms, the ultimate principle that explains everything else. This is admittedly abstract and difficult to grasp, which is why Socrates immediately offers another analogy in Book 7 to clarify further. But even from this brief discussion, we can see the central role the good plays in Plato's philosophy. Knowledge isn't just having correct beliefs. It's understanding how everything relates to the good, seeing the purpose and value inherent in reality itself. The philosopher who has grasped the good, therefore, has comprehensive understanding. Not just knowledge of particular things, but knowledge of the ultimate principle that makes everything intelligible. Why does this qualify philosophers to rule? Because ruling is fundamentally about pursuing the good of the city. If you don't know what the good truly is, you're merely guessing or following convention or pursuing what seems good. The philosopher-king who has grasped the form of the good can distinguish genuine goods from apparent goods, can order the city toward what's truly valuable, rather than toward what people happen to desire. This is why Socrates insists that all the other virtues, courage, justice, moderation, are useless without knowledge of the good. You need to know what's truly good before you can correctly pursue it through courage, implement it through justice, or limit yourself through moderation. Book 6 ends with Socrates outlining the educational program that produces Philosopher-Kings. This program is elaborate and lengthy, requiring decades of training. It begins in childhood with music and gymnastics, as already discussed. But the philosophically gifted receive additional education. In their teens and 20s, they study mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. These mathematical studies train the mind to think abstractly, to grasp unchanging relationships, and to seek explanations beyond the visible world. Why mathematics? Because mathematical objects are intermediate between sensible particulars and forms. When you study geometry, you're not studying this particular triangle drawn in sand, but the ideal triangle, the essence of triangularity that all particular triangles imperfectly exemplify. Mathematics thus prepares the mind for philosophy by teaching it to think about abstract universal truths rather than particular, changing sensibles. Someone who can grasp that the angles of a triangle necessarily sum to 180 degrees has taken a step toward grasping eternal, necessary truths, which is what the forms are. After extensive mathematical training around age 30, the best students proceed to dialectic, philosophical dialogue and argument aimed at understanding the forms themselves. Dialectic involves giving and asking for accounts of things, examining definitions, following arguments wherever they lead, and ultimately grasping the relationships among the forms and their grounding in the good. This is the highest form of study, and it's dangerous if pursued too early. Young people who learn dialectic before their characters are formed often become cynical sophists, using their argumentative skills to undermine all beliefs without arriving at truth. Those who excel at dialectic spend several years in pure philosophical study, but around age 35 they must be sent back down, forced to take military and political office to gain practical experience. This tests them in real-world situations. Can they maintain their philosophical convictions under pressure? Can they apply their theoretical knowledge to concrete problems? Those who succeed continue alternating between philosophical study and practical service until age 50. At 50, those who have successfully completed this entire program, who have excelled in music, gymnastics, mathematics, dialectic, and practical affairs, finally grasp the form of the good itself. Having achieved this ultimate knowledge, they're required to take turns ruling the city, using their knowledge to govern well. They'll spend most of their time in philosophical contemplation, which is their true love, but they'll also serve terms as rulers, organizing the city according to their understanding of the good. When they die, they'll be honored as divine beings and worshipped by the city. This educational program spans roughly 30 years from age 20 to 50. It's extraordinarily demanding and highly selective. Only a few people have the natural ability to complete it, and even fewer successfully resist corruption along the way. But those who do complete it are the Philosopher-Kings, people with comprehensive knowledge of truth, virtue, and the good, tempered by practical experience and motivated by duty rather than desire for power. Book 6 thus deepens our understanding of philosophy and Philosopher-Kings. We've learned why philosophers seem useless or vicious in corrupt cities, how true philosophers differ from sophists, what the form of the good is, and why it's the highest object of knowledge, and how the ideal city would educate Philosopher-Kings through mathematics and dialectic. All of this supports the central claim that only philosophers should rule, because only philosophers have the knowledge necessary to govern well. Before moving to Book 7, let's consider some critical questions this raises. First, is knowledge of the good really necessary for good government? One might argue that practical wisdom, experience, good judgment, understanding of human nature and politics is more important than theoretical knowledge of abstract forms. A philosopher who has studied the forms might be worse at governing than an experienced politician who knows how people actually behave and what policies actually work. Second, even if knowledge of the good is valuable, does it require the elaborate metaphysics of forms? Perhaps rulers need to understand what human flourishing is and what serves the common good. But maybe this understanding comes from experience, empirical observation, and practical reason rather than from contemplating eternal forms. Plato's epistemology might be unnecessarily elaborate for the political point he wants to make. Third, there's something paradoxical about philosophers ruling. If philosophy is the highest life, if contemplation is the best human activity, then making philosophers rule is making them live a worse life. Plato acknowledges this. He says the philosophers will be reluctant rulers, and he has to compel them to rule. But this suggests a conflict between what's best for the individual philosopher and what's best for the city. The Philosopher-King must sacrifice personal fulfillment for civic duty. Is this really justice? Or is it asking the best people to live worse lives than they otherwise could? Fourth, the educational program Socrates describes is so demanding and so lengthy that very few people could complete it. This means political power would be concentrated in a tiny elite who share the same education and the same philosophical commitments. There would be no checks on their power except their own supposed wisdom. What if they're wrong? What if their philosophical conclusions are mistaken? Without any mechanism for accountability or correction, even well-meaning philosopher-kings could do tremendous harm if their philosophy leads them astray. These questions point to deep tensions in Plato's political philosophy, tensions between individual and city, between theory and practice, between knowledge and experience, between unity and diversity. Book 7 will continue exploring these themes through the most famous image in the dialogue, the Allegory of the Cave. In Book 7, the Allegory of the Cave and the Philosopher's Education. Book 7 opens with one of the most powerful and enduring images in all of philosophy, the Allegory of the Cave. This allegory serves multiple purposes. It illustrates the difference between the world of appearances and the world of reality, explains the difficulty of philosophical enlightenment, and shows why philosophers must return to politics even though they'd prefer to remain in contemplation. Let's work through this allegory carefully, as it encapsulates much of Plato's epistemology and political philosophy. Socrates asks us to imagine prisoners who have been chained in an underground cave since childhood. They are chained in such a way that they can only look straight ahead at the wall in front of them. They cannot turn their heads or look behind them. Behind the prisoners, higher up, burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway, and along this walkway people carry various objects, statues of humans and animals, artifacts of all kinds, which cast shadows on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners see only these shadows. They never see the actual objects, never see the fire, never see each other except as shadows. What would life be like for these prisoners? They would think the shadows are reality. If a shadow of a horse passes by, they'd think, "There goes a horse," not realizing they're seeing merely a shadow of an artifact of a horse, twice removed from an actual horse. If some shadows appear more frequently or prominently, the prisoners might become experts in predicting which shadows will appear next. And they'd honor those among them with the best predictive abilities. They'd have a whole world of discourse about the shadows, never realizing that what they're discussing isn't real. Now imagine one prisoner is freed. At first he's confused and disoriented. When he turns around and sees the fire, it hurts his eyes. He's never seen bright light before. When he's told that the objects carried along the walkway are more real than the shadows, he doesn't believe it. The shadows seem more real to him because they're what he's always known. He'd want to turn back to the shadows, which are comfortable and familiar. But suppose the freed prisoner is dragged forcibly up a steep and rocky path out of the cave into the sunlight. The pain would be excruciating. The sunlight is so bright that he can't see anything at all initially. He'd be angry at whoever dragged him up there, preferring the dim cave to this overwhelming brightness. Only gradually, as his eyes adjust, can he start to see. First he might see shadows and reflections in water. Images still, but images of real things rather than images of artifacts. Then he could look at actual objects, trees, stones, animals. Eventually he could look at the sun itself and understand that the sun is the source of light, the cause of the seasons, and in a sense the cause of everything visible. Having seen all this, the freed prisoner would realize how much better his new understanding is than his old life in the cave. He would pity the prisoners still trapped below. He would have no desire to return to the cave and compete for honors based on predicting shadow patterns, which now seem utterly trivial. If he did return to the cave, he'd have difficulty seeing in the darkness. His eyes, adjusted to sunlight, couldn't make out the shadows as well as those who'd never left. The prisoners would laugh at him, saying that going up ruined his vision. If he tried to free them and lead them upward, they might kill him rather than endure the painful journey. This allegory is dense with meaning, and Socrates proceeds to explain it systematically. The cave represents the visible world, the realm of sensible changing particulars that we perceive with our bodily senses. The prisoners represent ordinary people who take sensory experience as reality and never question whether there's something deeper. The shadows represent images and opinions, second-hand beliefs derived from rhetoric, poetry, and convention rather than direct experience or understanding. The journey upward out of the cave represents philosophical education, the difficult process of moving from opinion to knowledge, from appearance to reality. The objects outside the cave represent the forms, the eternal, unchanging realities that are the true objects of knowledge. The sun represents the form of the good, which illuminates all other forms and makes knowledge possible, just as the physical sun illuminates physical objects and makes vision possible. The freed prisoner who has seen the sun represents the philosopher who has grasped the form of the good and achieved complete understanding. Several aspects of the allegory deserve emphasis. First, notice that enlightenment is painful and difficult. The prisoner doesn't want to be freed initially. The journey upward is described as steep and rocky. The sunlight hurts. This reflects Plato's understanding that philosophical education requires overcoming our natural attachments to familiar opinions and comfortable illusions. Most people resist philosophical questioning because it threatens their worldview and demands intellectual effort. True education isn't simply adding information. It's a conversion of the soul, a reorientation of desire from shadows to reality. Second, notice that the freed prisoner is compelled. He doesn't choose to be freed initially. Someone else frees him and drags him upward. And this might represent the role of teachers who push students beyond their comfort zones, or it might represent something about the nature of truth itself, that once you start questioning, you're drawn upward by the logic of inquiry, even if part of you resists. Either way, the allegory suggests that philosophical education requires some degree of compulsion, at least initially, because people naturally cling to familiar opinions. Third, notice the progression of vision. The prisoner doesn't immediately see the sun. First shadows and reflections, then objects, then the heavenly bodies at night, and only finally the sun itself. This represents the stages of education, first correcting false opinions, then grasping mathematical and scientific truths, then understanding the forms, and finally grasping the good itself. Each stage prepares for the next, and trying to skip stages leads to failure, which is why young people shouldn't study dialectic before their characters are formed, as Socrates mentioned in Book 6. Fourth, notice what happens when the philosopher returns to the cave. He can't see well in the darkness, and the prisoners mock him. This represents the philosopher's difficulty in conventional politics and ordinary life. Having seen truth, the philosopher finds it hard to take seriously the concerns that dominate most people's lives. Competitions for wealth, power, and reputation. These seem like prisoners arguing about shadows, but this makes the philosopher seem impractical and useless to ordinary people who think their concerns are important and are confirmed in this by the philosopher's inability to navigate their world effectively. Fifth, notice the danger. The prisoners might kill anyone who tries to free them. This surely alludes to the execution of Socrates, who was killed by Athens for questioning conventional beliefs and trying to lead people toward truth. The allegory thus contains a warning. Philosophy is dangerous in corrupt cities. Most people don't want enlightenment if it means abandoning their comfortable illusions, and they'll violently resist those who try to enlighten them. Finally, notice the philosopher's reluctance to return. Having seen the sun, the freed prisoner doesn't want to go back into the cave. He'd prefer to stay in the light, contemplating truth, but he must return, both out of duty to those still imprisoned and, in the case of the ideal city, out of obligation to the city that educated him. This captures the tension already noted. Philosophy is the best life, but philosophers must sacrifice some of their philosophical activity to rule. They'll do so reluctantly, not out of desire for power but out of duty. The cave allegory thus brings together epistemology, education, and politics. It shows us what knowledge is, grasping the forms, ultimately the good. How knowledge is achieved, through difficult, staged education. Why most people lack knowledge, they're prisoners of appearance and opinion. Why philosophers seem useless in ordinary cities, they can't see well in the darkness of opinion. And why philosophers must nonetheless engage in politics in the ideal city, to free others and to fulfill their obligations. After presenting the allegory, Socrates elaborates on the educational curriculum mentioned briefly in Book 6. He discusses in detail why each mathematical study is necessary for producing philosophers. Arithmetic teaches the mind to think about pure number, not just counted objects. Geometry teaches about eternal shapes and relations, not just physical figures. Astronomy, properly studied, isn't about particular stars and planets, their specific positions and movements, but about the mathematical relationships governing celestial motion. Harmonics similarly studies pure ratios that underlie musical intervals, not just pleasant sounds. The point of these studies is to draw the soul away from the becoming toward being, from the changeable toward the eternal. Someone studying arithmetic properly doesn't think here are 3 apples, but rather contemplates threeness itself, what it is that all trios share. This is preparation for studying the forms, which are also eternal and abstract. Mathematics is a bridge between the sensible and the intelligible, and crossing this bridge is essential for anyone who will eventually grasp the good. After mathematics comes dialectic, the highest form of study. Dialectic doesn't rely on sensory images or even mathematical diagrams. It works entirely through logos, through reasoned argument and discussion. The dialectician examines hypotheses, questions assumptions, gives and demands accounts of definitions, and ultimately traces all knowledge back to its unhypothetical first principle, the good itself. While mathematics takes certain axioms as starting points without proving them, dialectic questions even these, seeking to ground all knowledge in the ultimate principle that makes knowledge possible. Socrates emphasizes the danger of teaching dialectic too early. Young people who learn argument before their characters are mature often become sophists. They delight in refutation, tearing down everyone's beliefs, including their own, but they don't seek truth. They treat philosophy as a game, not as a serious pursuit of wisdom. This produces cynicism and nihilism, the belief that there are no real answers, only clever arguments. To prevent this corruption, dialectic should be taught only to those around 30 years old, who have already demonstrated stable character through their earlier education and conduct. The educational program culminates, as mentioned, with those around 50 who have completed all stages and excelled in all tests, finally grasping the form of the good. Socrates is emphatic about this requirement. No one should rule who hasn't seen the good. Without this vision, rulers are blind guides. However well-meaning, they might have opinions about what's good, but they don't have knowledge. And a city ruled by opinion rather than knowledge will inevitably go astray. Book 7 concludes by returning to the question of feasibility. Can such a city actually exist? Socrates suggests that the most realistic scenario would be for some existing city to expel everyone over the age of 10, and then raise the remaining children according to the ideal educational system. This would avoid the problem of trying to re-educate adults who are already corrupted by bad upbringing. Start with young children, give them proper education, and within a generation you'd have the beginnings of the ideal city. This suggestion is obviously impractical and even horrifying. Expel all the adults? But Socrates' point seems to be that creating the ideal city from scratch is easier than reforming existing corrupt cities. The real obstacle isn't resources or knowledge, but the fact that existing cities are filled with people whose characters have already been formed by bad education. These people won't accept the truth even if shown it, just as the prisoners in the cave would resist being freed. Yet Socrates maintains that the ideal city remains important even if it never exists. It exists as a paradigm, a pattern laid up in heaven, as he'll later say. We can use this paradigm to evaluate actual cities and to guide reform. Even if we can't create perfect justice, we can make cities more or less just by making them more or less like the ideal. And individuals can use the ideal city as a guide for ordering their own souls, living according to the ideal constitution even if their actual city is corrupt. Before moving to books 8 and 9, let's reflect on what the cave allegory and the discussion of education tell us about Plato's overall vision. Central to this vision is the idea that most people live in illusion. We take our ordinary experience and opinions as reality, never questioning whether there's something deeper and truer. We're satisfied with shadows, not even knowing that we're seeing shadows rather than real things. Philosophy is the project of awakening from this illusion. of ascending from appearance to reality, from opinion to knowledge. This awakening is difficult and painful because it requires giving up comforting beliefs and facing truths that challenge our values and self-understanding. Most people never awaken, and those who do often face hostility from those still trapped in illusion. Yet the awakening is worth it because only knowledge brings true happiness. The philosopher who has seen the good lives better even in the cave than those who have never left. Because the philosopher's understanding gives meaning and direction that mere opinion cannot provide. Education, in this vision, isn't primarily about transferring information or training skills, though these are involved. At its deepest level, education is about turning the soul toward truth, reorienting desire from shadows to reality. This requires the right sequence of studies at the right times, taught by those who already understand. It requires protecting students from premature exposure to dialectic that might corrupt them, and it requires selecting students based on natural aptitude, since not everyone has the philosophical nature necessary for the highest education. This elitist dimension of Plato's thought troubles many readers. Only a few can complete the philosophical education. Only these few can truly know. Only these few should rule. The masses will live in opinion, guided by those with knowledge. There's no democracy here, no notion that everyone's opinion counts equally. Rather, there's a stark hierarchy. Those who know should guide those who don't, just as seeing guides blind. Yet Plato might argue this isn't arbitrary elitism. If some people really do have knowledge while others have mere opinion, then of course those with knowledge should make important decisions. You'd want a doctor who knows medicine treating you rather than having treatment decided by democratic vote of people with no medical knowledge. Why should political decisions be different? If Philosopher-Kings really do know what's good, better than ordinary citizens do, then they should rule. The question is whether anyone really has such knowledge, and whether Plato's metaphysics of forms correctly identifies what knowledge is. Books 8 and 9. The Decline of Constitutions and Souls. Having completed the construction of the ideal city and the ideal soul, Socrates now turns to examine imperfect cities and souls. Books 8 and 9 present a taxonomy of political constitutions and corresponding psychological types, arranged in order of declining justice and happiness. This analysis serves multiple purposes. It shows what happens when the ideal order breaks down. It provides a comparative framework for evaluating actual cities. And it finally answers Glaucon and Adimantus' challenge by showing that the just life is happier than the unjust life. Socrates identifies 5 types of constitution, each corresponding to a type of soul. First is aristocracy, rule by the best, which is the ideal city they've constructed. Second is timocracy, rule by those who love honor. Third is oligarchy, rule by the wealthy. Fourth is democracy, rule by the people. Fifth is tyranny, rule by a tyrant. Each form arises from the corruption of the previous form, and each is progressively worse and more unjust than the one before. The analysis begins with a puzzling question. How does aristocracy, if it's truly best, ever decline? If the philosopher-kings have knowledge and rule wisely, why would the ideal city ever deteriorate? Socrates offers a complex numerological explanation involving the geometric number and breeding cycles, but the basic idea is that even philosopher-kings can't perfectly control human reproduction. Eventually, children will be born who don't have golden natures, but are mistakenly promoted to the guardian class. Or truly, golden children might be born to the producing class but not identified and promoted. Once the wrong people become guardians, decline begins. The first stage of decline is timocracy. This occurs when the guardian class begins to value honor more than wisdom. The guardians start competing for recognition and glory, rather than seeking truth and serving the city. They become more focused on military prowess and physical courage than on philosophy and reason. Gradually, they introduce private property, enslaving or subjugating the producing class rather than protecting them. The city becomes oriented toward war and conquest, with honor going to successful warriors rather than wise rulers. The timocratic soul corresponds to this constitution. In the timocratic person, the spirited part of the soul dominates rather than reason. Such a person values honor, victory, and glory above wisdom or pleasure. They're courageous and ambitious, but also proud, contentious, and potentially aggressive. Socrates illustrates this with a character sketch. Imagine a young man raised by a philosophic father, but influenced by a mother and servants who criticize the father for being too passive and not pursuing wealth and power. The young man develops a divided soul, pulled between his father's philosophical values and his mother's conventional values of honor and success. Eventually, the spirited part wins out, and he becomes focused on honor and competition. The timocratic man is better than those to come. He still has some respect for education and reason, and he's capable of discipline and courage. But he's worse than the philosophical person because he values honor rather than truth, and he seeks to dominate others rather than to understand them. He'll make a competent soldier or administrator, but not a wise ruler. Timocracy declines into oligarchy. As private property becomes more important, the guardians start valuing wealth rather than honor. Those who accumulate wealth gain power, and eventually a property qualification is established. Only those above a certain level of wealth can hold office. The city becomes divided into rich and poor, with the rich ruling and the poor being ruled. This creates internal conflict. The city is really two cities, rich and poor, constantly in tension. The poor resent the rich fear the poor. Unity is lost. Moreover, oligarchic cities produce extremes of wealth and poverty. The rich become idle and luxurious, not even maintaining their own military skills, eventually hiring mercenaries for protection. The poor become desperate, without resources or opportunity, like drones or criminals waiting to sting. The city is unstable, filled with beggars and criminals, unable to wage effective war because the rich won't arm the poor, fearing them, and can't fight themselves, having become soft. The oligarchic soul is dominated by appetite, specifically the appetite for wealth. The oligarchic person values money above all else. They're thrifty, hardworking, and focused on accumulation. They satisfy only their necessary appetites, those required for survival or profit, while suppressing unnecessary appetites through force rather than through reason. They appear respectable and orderly on the surface, but internally they're in conflict. Their better desires are held down by worse ones, not through genuine virtue, but through fear of losing wealth. Socrates emphasizes that the oligarchic person isn't truly virtuous, even if they appear law-abiding. They refrain from injustice only because they fear punishment or loss of property, not because they love justice. If they could profit from injustice without consequence, they would. They're like the city itself, appearing unified, but actually divided, with internal tensions barely contained. Oligarchy declines into democracy. As wealth concentration continues, more and more people fall into poverty. Eventually, the poor revolt, kill, or exile the rich, and establish democracy where all citizens are free and equal, each able to do as they please. The city becomes full of diversity and freedom, with no single way of life privileged over others. You can do whatever you want, engage in business or politics or philosophy, or none of these. There's no compulsion, no unified direction, just individual liberty to pursue whatever seems best to each person. Democracy might sound attractive. Freedom and equality are appealing values. But Socrates argues that democratic freedom is actually a kind of disorder. Without any principle of order, without anyone with knowledge guiding the city, decisions are made by majority vote of people with no expertise. Demagogues arise who flatter the people and tell them what they want to hear, rather than what they need to hear. The city becomes unable to distinguish between the worthy and the unworthy, the knowledgeable and the ignorant. Everyone's opinion counts equally, regardless of whether they have any idea what they're talking about. Moreover, democratic freedom extends to every aspect of life. Children have no respect for parents, students no respect for teachers, young no respect for old. Everyone is equal, which means traditional authority structures break down. Even animals in democratic cities are free and proud, Socrates jokes, barely getting out of the way in the streets. The city becomes anarchic, with no governing principle except individual desire. The democratic soul mirrors this disorder. In the democratic person, all appetites are treated as equal, necessary and unnecessary, noble and base, wise and foolish. All desires have equal claim, and the person satisfies whichever desire is currently strongest. Today they drink and party, tomorrow they exercise, the next day they study philosophy, then they enter politics, then they go into business. There's no organizing principle, no hierarchy of values, just random succession of whims. Socrates calls this freedom and diversity, but it's really incoherence. The person has no unified direction or purpose, yet the democratic person is pleasant and tolerant. They don't impose their values on others because they don't have firm values to impose. They're accepting of different lifestyles because they themselves dabble in everything. They appear colorful and interesting like a coat of many colors, but their life lacks depth or achievement because they never commit to any single pursuit long enough to excel at it. Democracy declines into tyranny through a dialectic of excessive freedom. When everyone does whatever they want with no restraint, appetites grow stronger and more demanding. People need more and more stimulation, more intense pleasures, to satisfy their increasingly jaded desires. The young become dominated by unnecessary and even lawless appetites, desires for things that provide no benefit and may be actively harmful, like excessive drink, sex, gambling, or violence. These lawless appetites, normally restrained by reason or shame, come to dominate. As disorder increases, people begin to long for order and security. They want someone strong to restore stability. A demagogue arises who promises to protect the people from their enemies, both foreign and domestic. At first, he's popular and benevolent, distributing wealth and making grand promises. But to maintain power, he must eliminate rivals and critics. He accuses the best citizens of being enemies of the people and has them exiled or killed. He surrounds himself with bodyguards and mercenaries fearing assassination. Eventually, he becomes a full tyrant, the worst form of human being ruling through fear and violence. The tyrannical soul is the ultimate corruption. In the tyrant, the most lawless appetites rule completely. Socrates describes these as appetites that emerge in dreams when reason sleeps. Desires to commit any crime, have sex with anyone including family members, eat forbidden foods, blaspheme against gods, all the desires that civilized people suppress. In most people, these desires exist but are controlled by reason. In the democratic person, they exist but are satisfied occasionally in moderation. In the tyrant, they dominate completely. The tyrant is enslaved to his own appetites. He's never satisfied, always wanting more, willing to do anything to satisfy his desires. He steals from his parents, commits sacrilege, murders friends. Nothing is off limits. And because his appetites are insatiable, he's always in need, always suffering, never at peace. He lives in fear because he's created enemies everywhere. He trusts no one because his own behavior shows him that no one can be trusted. He's literally a prisoner of his own desires, forced to satisfy them but never able to. Moreover, the tyrant, whether as individual or as ruler of a city, is the least free and least happy of all people. He must constantly fear plots and assassination attempts. He cannot trust friends because friendship requires virtue, which he lacks. He cannot enjoy simple pleasures because his appetites are so excessive that only extreme stimulation registers. He is haunted by guilt and fear, never at rest, never content. The tyrannical life, which Thrasymachus praised as the happiest, is actually the most miserable. Having described all 5 types, Socrates now ranks them in order of justice and happiness. The aristocratic soul, ruled by reason, is most just and most happy. The timocratic soul is second, the oligarchic third, the democratic fourth, and the tyrannical fifth. Each step down involves increasing internal conflict, less integration, less self-control, and less happiness. The progression shows that justice, proper ordering of the soul, produces happiness, while injustice, disorder of the soul, produces misery. Socrates offers several arguments for this ranking. First, there's the argument from authority, the philosopher, who has experienced both philosophical pleasures and bodily pleasures, judges philosophical pleasures superior. The tyrant, by contrast, has never experienced genuine philosophical or even honor-loving pleasures. He's trapped in bodily appetite. So the philosopher's judgment is better informed, and the philosopher says the just life is happier. Second, there's the argument about the nature of pleasure. true pleasure involves filling a real lack with something genuinely good. But many so-called pleasures are merely cessations of pain or filling of artificial lacks. When you're hungry and eat, that's pleasant. You're filling a real need. But when you become addicted to some intense stimulation and then feel deprived without it, satisfying that craving isn't true pleasure. It's just relief from self-imposed suffering. The tyrant's pleasures are mostly of this spurious kind, intense but unfulfilling, always requiring more, never bringing satisfaction. Third, there's the argument from calculation. If you measure the distance between aristocracy and tyranny, counting the intermediate types, you can calculate how much less pleasure the tyrant has. Through some elaborate numerology, which may be partly humorous, Socrates calculates that the philosopher is exactly 729 times happier than the tyrant. Whether we take this number seriously or not, the point is clear. The difference isn't small, it's vast. The just person is incomparably happier than the unjust person. This completes the answer to Glaucon and Adimantus's challenge. They asked whether justice is valuable for its own sake, whether the just person is happier than the unjust person, even if the just person has a terrible reputation, and the unjust person has a good reputation. Socrates has now shown that justice is psychic health, proper ordering of the soul, and that this ordering brings happiness regardless of external circumstances. The person with a well-ordered soul lives better than the person with a disordered soul, no matter what their external conditions. The philosopher-king, even if exiled and impoverished, would be happier than the tyrant ruling a vast empire, because internal order is more valuable than external goods. Books 8 and 9 thus serve as both political analysis and psychological analysis. They show how cities degenerate when they abandon the principle of rule by knowledge, and how souls degenerate when they abandon the rule of reason. They vindicate the central claim of the dialogue, that justice is beneficial to the one who possesses it, that virtue is its own reward, and that the apparently successful unjust person is actually miserable. Before moving to Book 10, we should note some questions this analysis raises. First, is Plato's taxonomy accurate? Must cities progress through these exact stages in this exact order? Historical evidence suggests otherwise. Cities don't follow neat patterns of degeneration. Plato seems to be offering ideal types, theoretical models, rather than empirical descriptions. The question is whether these models illuminate reality even if they don't perfectly describe it. Second, is Plato fair to democracy? His description makes democracy sound chaotic and anarchic, but many would argue that democracy at its best involves meaningful freedom, genuine equality, and respectful debate. Plato saw Athenian democracy execute Socrates, so his hostility is understandable, but it might have led him to overlook democracy's virtues. Third, the connection between constitution and soul is complex. Does living in a democracy make you a democratic person? Or do democratic people create democratic cities? Plato seems to think both. Cities shape souls through education and culture, while souls shape cities through their collective choices and values. But this creates a chicken and egg problem about how change happens. Fourth, while Socrates has shown that the tyrannical life is miserable, has he shown that perfect justice brings perfect happiness? The philosopher in the ideal city lives well, but what about just people in corrupt cities? The person trying to be just in a democracy or oligarchy might suffer greatly. Socrates would presumably say that even so, they're happier than if they were unjust, because they maintain internal order. But this is a hard sell to someone being tortured for their virtue, which was part of Glaucon's original challenge. Book 10, Poetry, Immortality, and the Myth of Book 10 serves as both a conclusion and an expansion of the Republic. After completing the main argument about justice, Socrates returns to a topic discussed briefly earlier, the role of poetry in the ideal city. This leads to a famous and controversial critique of imitative art. Then, to strengthen the case for justice, Socrates argues for the immortality of the soul and concludes with the myth of air, a visionary account of the afterlife that frames the entire dialogue in cosmic perspective. Socrates begins by congratulating himself and his interlocutors for having excluded most poetry from the ideal city. Now that they've fully analyzed the soul and its parts, they can see more clearly why this exclusion was necessary. The issue isn't just the content of poetry, the false stories about gods and heroes that they criticized in books 2 and 3. The issue is the very nature of imitative poetry itself, what it does to the soul of those who experience it, without the antidote of knowledge about what it really is. To explain this, Socrates introduces his theory of 3 levels of reality. Consider a bed. First, there's the form of the bed, the eternal, perfect idea of what a bed is, created by God. Second, there's the particular bed crafted by a carpenter, a physical object that imperfectly participates in the form. Third, there's a painting of a bed created by an artist, an image of a particular bed, which is itself an image of the form. The painting is thus twice removed from reality, an imitation of an imitation. This hierarchical ontology places poets and painters in a troubling position. They don't create reality, like God creating the forms, or even useful physical objects, like the carpenter creating actual beds. They create images, representations that have no substance or utility. The painter doesn't need to know how to make a bed or even how to use one effectively. He just needs to know how to make it look like a bed from a certain angle. Similarly, the poet doesn't need genuine knowledge of warfare to write about warriors, or knowledge of virtue to depict virtuous characters. The poet needs only the ability to imitate appearance convincingly. This means poetry operates in the realm of appearance rather than truth. The poet is an imitator who deals in images, who creates representations 3 times removed from reality: the form, the particular, and the image of the particular. Someone who spends time with poetry is therefore spending time with shadows of shadows, not with reality itself. This is dangerous because it reinforces the condition of the prisoners in the cave, taking images for reality, never ascending to genuine knowledge. Socrates extends this critique by examining what part of the soul poetry appeals to. Reason is concerned with measurement, calculation, and distinguishing appearance from reality. If you look at a stick half submerged in water, it appears bent, but reason, using measurement, determines it's actually straight. Reason corrects the distortions of perception, but poetry and painting appeal not to reason, but to the part of the soul that experiences and trusts appearance without rational correction. They appeal to the irrational part: emotion, sensation, immediate response. This is particularly problematic with tragic poetry. When we watch a tragedy, we experience intense emotions: grief, fear, pity, and we indulge these emotions in ways we wouldn't in ordinary life. If we suffered a personal tragedy, reason would tell us to bear it with dignity, not to wail and lament excessively. But when watching a tragedy, we let ourselves feel extreme emotions. We weep and identify with suffering characters, and we praise the poet who most intensely arouses these feelings. The problem is that indulging emotions in the theater strengthens the emotional part of the soul. We train ourselves to be emotional, to respond to images and stories with feeling rather than rational judgment. The same applies to comedy and other forms of poetry. In comedy, we laugh at shameful things, crude jokes, buffoonish behavior that we'd restrain ourselves from in real life. We let our sense of humor run wild in ways we'd consider inappropriate otherwise. But this indulgence strengthens the foolish, undisciplined part of the soul. We become people who can't restrain laughter, who are governed by immediate amusement rather than rational judgment about what's truly ridiculous. Socrates concludes that poetry, especially dramatic imitative poetry, must be largely excluded from the ideal city. Only hymns to the gods and praises of good people should be admitted. Poetry that doesn't involve imitating base characters or arousing excessive emotions. Homer and the tragedians, despite being beloved, must be sent away with honor but firmly excluded, because their work corrupts the soul by strengthening its irrational parts and weakening reason's control. This critique of poetry has troubled readers for centuries. Homer was the foundation of Greek education and culture, and Plato himself is a superb literary artist. The Republic is a dramatic dialogue featuring vivid characters, powerful imagery like the cave allegory, and emotionally compelling myths. How can Plato critique imitative art while creating it? Several responses are possible. Some scholars argue Plato is distinguishing between poetry that claims to teach truth and poetry that acknowledges its fictional status. Homer was treated as a source of wisdom about everything, from military strategy to ethics. Plato objects to this. Homer shouldn't be treated as an authority on things he has no expertise in, but poetry that doesn't claim authority, that entertains without pretending to educate, might be acceptable. Others argue that philosophical dialogues like the Republic are different from poetry because they engage reason even while using literary techniques. The dialogue form involves argument and analysis, not just emotional manipulation. Still others think Plato is being deliberately ironic or self-critical, acknowledging tension between philosophy and poetry that can't be fully resolved. Whatever we make of this puzzle, Socrates' critique raises important questions about art's relationship to truth and its effects on character. Does engaging with fictional representations of vice make us more vicious? Does emotional engagement with tragedy strengthen undesirable emotions? Or does art provide valuable experience and catharsis that actually benefits character? These questions remain debated today in discussions about media effects, violent video games, and the relationship between art and morality. Having dealt with poetry, Socrates turns to an argument for immortality of the soul. This might seem like a digression, but it's actually crucial for the overall argument. If the soul is immortal, then the consequences of justice extend beyond this life. Even if the just person suffers in this life, they'll be rewarded eternally. This provides additional reason to be just and strengthens the case that justice benefits its possessor. The argument for immortality proceeds from the principle that each thing is destroyed by its characteristic evil, and only by that. Eyes are destroyed by disease, wood by rot, iron by rust. If something has a characteristic evil that affects it but doesn't destroy it, then nothing else can destroy it either. Now, what's the characteristic evil of the soul? Injustice, cowardice, ignorance. These are vices that afflict the soul. But notice, these vices make the soul worse but don't destroy it. The unjust person's soul still exists, even though it's in terrible condition. If the soul's own characteristic evils don't destroy it, then nothing can destroy it, not bodily death or anything else. Therefore, the soul is immortal. This argument is intriguing but perhaps not fully convincing. It assumes that everything has a characteristic evil that uniquely destroys it, and that if that characteristic evil doesn't destroy something, nothing can. But why accept these premises? Moreover, even if the soul survives bodily death, does it survive as the same soul with memory and personality intact? Or does it dissipate into some impersonal consciousness? Plato seems to assume personal survival, but his argument doesn't clearly establish this. Nevertheless, having argued for immortality, Socrates can now address the rewards of justice in this life and the next. In this life, he argues, the gods favor the just person. Even if the just person suffers temporarily, in the long run they'll be rewarded. Their good reputation will eventually be recognized. They'll receive honors and benefits, and they'll live well. This might seem to contradict the earlier argument that justice should be valued apart from reputation and rewards. But Socrates' point is that he's already shown justice is valuable in itself. Now he's adding that it also brings external rewards. Justice is valuable both intrinsically and instrumentally. More importantly, in the afterlife, the consequences of justice are eternal. To illustrate this, Socrates tells the myth of one of the most haunting and influential passages in ancient philosophy. Was a warrior who died in battle, but came back to life 12 days later, just as his body was about to be cremated. He reported what he had seen in the afterlife, providing a vision of cosmic justice and the soul's fate. According to account, souls after death come to a place of judgment, where there are openings in the earth leading downward and openings in the sky leading upward. Judges examine each soul, sending the just upward to heaven and the unjust downward to punishment. Saw souls returning from both directions after a 1,000-year journey. Those returning from heaven reported incredible beauty and bliss, spending time in meadows, seeing divine visions, experiencing pure happiness. Those returning from below reported terrible punishments, being whipped by guardians, suffering torments 10 times over for each injustice committed, tortured for centuries. Some souls were so wicked they weren't allowed to leave the underworld at all. Saw these souls, tyrants and great criminals, attempt to ascend but be seized by savage men, flayed and dragged over thorns, tortured eternally. The message is clear. Injustice brings cosmic consequences. The tyrant, who seemed to live the best life from Thrasymachus's perspective, actually suffers the worst fate of all, both in this life, as shown in Book 9, and the next. After their 1,000-year journey, souls gather in a meadow for 7 days, then proceed to witness the cosmos itself. Describes the souls seeing the spindle of necessity, a cosmological image of planets, and stars as whorls on a spindle, with the fates, daughters of necessity, singing and directing cosmic order. This elaborate, mythic cosmology represents the ordered, lawful nature of the universe, governed by rational necessity rather than chaos or arbitrary divine whim. Then comes the most philosophically significant part of the myth, the choice of lives. Each soul is assigned a number by lot, and in that order, they choose their next life from a vast array of possibilities. Lives of animals and humans, tyrants and beggars, famous and obscure, male and female. The choice is free, but the order of choosing is determined by lot. Some souls, especially those descending from heaven who haven't experienced suffering, choose poorly. One soul rashly chooses the life of a tyrant, only realizing afterward that this life involves eating his own children and committing terrible crimes. He blames fortune and gods for his choice, but the spokesman for the fates declares, the responsibility is the chooser's. God is not responsible. This moment encapsulates Plato's view of moral responsibility. We are responsible for what we become through our choices. God provides the framework and possibilities, but we choose our character and thus our fate. Someone who has lived justly and gained wisdom will choose wisely. Someone corrupted by previous injustice will likely choose badly. Your current character shapes your future choice, which shapes your future character in an ongoing cycle. Reports that Odysseus's soul, having suffered greatly in his heroic life and learning from that suffering, chose last. Freed from ambition and the love of honor, Odysseus's soul searched carefully for a long time until it found the life of an ordinary private citizen who minded his own business. Odysseus said he would have chosen this life even if he'd chosen first, having learned through experience that the life of fame and adventure is not the best life. The quiet, just life of philosophy is superior. After choosing, souls drink from the river of forgetfulness, forgetting their time in the afterlife and their previous lives. They're then shot like stars to be born into their chosen lives. Alone wasn't allowed to drink, so he could return to report what he'd seen. He woke up on his funeral pyre and told his story as a warning to the living, care for your soul, practice justice, seek wisdom, because your choices have eternal consequences. The myth of serves several functions in the dialogue. First, it provides mythic reinforcement for the philosophical arguments already made. If the arguments for justice didn't fully convince, perhaps this vision of cosmic justice will. Second, it addresses the problem of injustice that seems to go unpunished in this life. The tyrant may appear successful here, but cosmic justice ensures appropriate consequences eventually. Third, it emphasizes human responsibility for character. We choose who we become through our decisions, and those choices have eternal significance. Fourth, it provides a fitting conclusion to the dialogue by placing the entire discussion in cosmic context. We're not just talking about politics in Athens or individual psychology. We're talking about the fundamental structure of reality and the soul's eternal journey. The dialogue concludes with Socrates' final exhortation. We must practice justice and wisdom always, both in this life and the 1,000-year journey afterward. If we do so, we'll be dear to ourselves and to the gods. We'll fare well both here and in the afterlife, winning the prizes that justice brings. This is why we must care above all for our souls, making them as good as possible. Everything else, wealth, power, reputation, is secondary. Only justice and wisdom matter ultimately, because only they determine the soul's fate across eternity. Thus, Book 10 thus completes the Republic by addressing two loose ends, the question of poetry and the question of afterlife rewards. The critique of poetry reinforces the priority of philosophy over rhetoric and art. Only knowledge, not imitation, should guide education and politics. The argument for immortality and the myth of Ur extend the case for justice beyond this life, showing that cosmic justice ultimately prevails even when earthly justice fails. Together they provide a comprehensive defense of the philosophical life. We should order our souls according to reason, seek knowledge of the forms, practice justice, and rule cities according to wisdom. This is the path to both temporal and eternal happiness. Before moving to critical engagement with the Republic as a whole, let's reflect on what Book 10 adds to our understanding. The critique of poetry reveals Plato's deep suspicion of emotional manipulation and appearance divorced from reality. He sees art as potentially corrupting when it engages the irrational parts of the soul without rational guidance. This is consistent with his broader epistemology. Truth requires ascending from images to forms, from appearance to reality, from opinion to knowledge. Poetry pulls in the opposite direction, making us comfortable with images and emotions rather than pushing us toward rational understanding. The argument for immortality and the myth introduce explicitly religious or metaphysical elements that have not been prominent earlier. While the forms are metaphysical entities, they've been discussed philosophically. Here we have mythic cosmology, souls traveling through heaven and underworld, cosmic spindles, fates singing, reincarnation. How literally should we take this? Plato signals it's a myth, a story, not demonstrated truth. Yet he also seems to think the myth conveys important truths, that souls are immortal, that actions have consequences beyond this life, that we're responsible for our character, that the cosmos is rationally ordered. The myth is philosophy's attempt to speak about matters beyond rational demonstration using story and image where argument reaches its limits. This raises questions about the relationship between philosophy and myth in Plato. Throughout the dialogue, Socrates has insisted on rational argument, dialectic, logical examination of beliefs. Yet at key moments, the noble lie, the cave allegory, the myth of Ur, he uses myths. Are these pedagogical tools to make philosophy accessible? Are they placeholders for truths that can't be fully articulated philosophically? Or do they represent a different kind of knowledge, poetic or intuitive rather than rational? Plato doesn't fully answer this question, and scholars remain divided about how to interpret his use of myth alongside philosophy. Critical engagement with the Republic. Having completed our journey through the Republic, we now need to step back and evaluate the work critically. What are its enduring insights? What are its limitations and problems? How should we assess Plato's arguments, both within their historical context and from our contemporary perspective? This critical engagement will examine the major scholarly interpretations and critiques of the dialogue, discuss its strengths and weaknesses, and explore its continuing relevance. Major scholarly interpretations. Scholars have interpreted the Republic in radically different ways, and these interpretations affect how we evaluate the work. Let's consider several major approaches. The literalist reading takes Plato at face value. He's genuinely proposing that philosophers should rule, that the ideal city with its three classes and communal living should be implemented if possible, and that justice consists in each part of the soul doing its proper work. On this reading, we should evaluate the Republic as a work of political philosophy that offers a blueprint for the ideal state. The question becomes whether Plato's political proposals are good ones, whether Philosopher-Kings, abolition of family, eugenic breeding, and the rest would actually produce a just and happy society. The metaphorical reading suggests that Plato isn't primarily interested in political reform, but in using the city as a large-scale model to understand the soul. The real subject is individual ethics and psychology, not politics. The construction of the ideal city is a thought experiment designed to reveal truths about justice in the individual soul. On this reading, we shouldn't criticize Plato's politics because he's not seriously advocating for those policies. He's using political theory as a tool for psychological analysis. The ironic reading claims that Plato intentionally creates an absurd or problematic political vision to show the limits of political idealism. By pushing the logic of collectivism and rational control to its extreme, Plato reveals the totalitarian implications of trying to perfect politics through philosophy. The dialogue is warning against philosopher-kings, not advocating for them. On this reading, Plato is much more sophisticated and self-critical than he initially appears, deliberately constructing a regime that seems ideal on the surface but is actually oppressive. The dialectical reading emphasizes that the Republic is a dialogue, not a treatise. Socrates is a character, not simply Plato's mouthpiece. The dialogue presents arguments and positions for examination, not final answers. We should read it as an ongoing philosophical investigation, noting tensions and problems within the arguments, rather than as a systematic presentation of Plato's doctrine. On this reading, the dialogue is designed to provoke thought and questioning rather than to transmit settled conclusions. Each interpretation has textual support and philosophical merit. The literalist reading takes seriously the elaborate detail Plato provides about the ideal city, detail that would be unnecessary if it were merely metaphorical. The metaphorical reading accounts for Socrates' explicit statement that he's examining the city to understand the soul, and for his admission that the ideal city may never exist. The ironic reading explains troubling features like the noble lie and the breeding program, which seem incompatible with Plato's commitment to truth. The dialectical reading respects the literary form of the work and avoids treating it as dogmatic philosophy. Likely, elements of all these interpretations are correct. Plato is serious about some claims while being playful or provocative about others. He's genuinely interested in both political theory and psychology, using each to illuminate the other. He's aware of tensions and problems in his arguments, but presents them anyway to stimulate thought. The dialogue resists any single definitive interpretation, which is part of what makes it philosophically rich and endlessly debatable. Strengths of the Republic. Despite its problems and controversies, the Republic contains enduring insights that continue to influence philosophy, political theory, and psychology. The analysis of justice as psychic harmony is profoundly important. Rather than defining justice as a set of rules or actions, Plato defines it as a state of the soul, an internal ordering where reason rules, spirit protects, and appetite is disciplined. This makes justice intrinsic rather than instrumental, valuable for what it is, rather than for what it produces. It also connects justice to human flourishing. A well-ordered soul functions better than a disordered one, just as a healthy body functions better than a sick one. This approach to ethics, focusing on character and the state of the soul rather than merely on actions and consequences, has been enormously influential. The tripartite psychology introduced in Book 4 remains a powerful model for understanding internal conflict and motivation. We do experience tension between reason, emotion, and appetite. We recognize the spirited part that gets angry at injustice and seeks honor. We understand the appetitive part that desires bodily pleasures. And we acknowledge the rational part that calculates and judges. While modern psychology is more complex, Plato's basic insight that the soul has multiple, sometimes conflicting sources of motivation anticipates contemporary theories of multiple motivational systems in the brain. His model provides a framework for thinking about self-control, akrasia, weakness of will, and psychological integration. The theory of forms, whatever its metaphysical difficulties, addresses real philosophical problems. How can we have objective knowledge if everything in the physical world is changing? What makes multiple things instances of the same type? What makes all circles circular, all beautiful things beautiful? How can we have standards for evaluation that transcend particular cases? The forms provide Plato's answer, eternal, unchanging realities that ground truth, meaning, and value. While few contemporary philosophers accept the forms as Plato conceived them, the problems he was addressing, the problem of universals, the nature of abstract objects, the objectivity of value, remain central to philosophy. The cave allegory is one of the most powerful images in Western thought. It captures the idea that ordinary life is a kind of illusion, that most people mistake appearance for reality, and that enlightenment requires a difficult ascent from opinion to knowledge. The allegory has been reinterpreted countless times. In religious contexts, Plato's cave as humanity before divine revelation. In political contexts, the cave as ideology or propaganda. In epistemological contexts, the cave as demonstrating the theory-ladenness of perception. Its richness lies in its ability to be applied to many forms of illusion and enlightenment, while retaining its essential structure. We must turn away from comfortable shadows toward uncomfortable truth. The critique of democracy raises important questions, even if we don't accept Plato's conclusions. Is there a tension between democracy, everyone's opinion counts equally, and expertise, some people know better? Should decisions be made by majority vote or by those with relevant knowledge? How do we balance political equality with recognition that people have different levels of competence? Contemporary debates about technocracy, populism, and the role of expertise in policymaking echo Plato's concerns. While we may defend democracy against his critique, we must take seriously the problems he identifies. The emphasis on education as central to both individual and political excellence remains vital. Plato recognizes that good institutions alone can't create a good society. You also need good people, and good people are produced through proper education. His attention to what children should learn, when they should learn it, and how education shapes character anticipates modern psychology and pedagogy, even if we reject his specific educational proposals. His insight that education is fundamentally about character formation, not just information transmission, seems correct. Weaknesses and objections to the Republic. While the Republic contains profound insights, it also faces serious criticisms that we must address honestly. These weaknesses fall into several categories: metaphysical, epistemological, political, and ethical. The metaphysics of forms faces significant problems. First, there's the third man argument that Plato himself addresses in later dialogues like the Parmenides. If a group of particular things are alike because they all participate in a form, and if the form resembles the particulars, then don't we need another form to explain the resemblance between the first form and the particulars, and then another form to explain that resemblance, leading to infinite regress? This threatens the explanatory power of forms. Second, forms seem to multiply endlessly. Is there a form of hair? Of mud? Of everything we can conceive, no matter how trivial or base? Plato seems ambivalent about this. He clearly thinks there are forms of important things like justice and beauty. But does his theory require forms of everything? If not, what's the principle that determines which things have forms and which don't? Third, the relationship between forms and particulars remains obscure. Plato uses metaphors. Particulars participate in or imitate forms. But what do these metaphors mean? How does a physical object relate to an abstract entity? How does the form of beauty, which is unchanging and non-spatial, somehow make a particular flower beautiful? The theory seems to posit a mysterious connection between two radically different kinds of reality without explaining how that connection works. Fourth, Aristotle famously objected that separating forms from particulars makes them useless for explaining the natural world. If the forms exist in a separate realm, eternally perfect and unchanging, how do they explain change, generation, and causation in the physical world? A form of human that exists apart from actual humans doesn't explain how humans grow, reproduce, and die. For explanation, we need principles immanent in nature, not transcendent forms. The epistemology also faces challenges. Plato claims that philosophers can have knowledge of forms through dialectic and rational insight, but how exactly does this work? We can't perceive forms with our senses. They're not physical. We grasp them intellectually, through pure reason. But how do we verify that we've correctly grasped a form? How do we distinguish genuine philosophical insight from illusion or error? Plato provides no clear methodology for confirming that someone has actually achieved knowledge of the forms, rather than merely having strong opinions. Moreover, even if knowledge of forms is possible, the connection to practical wisdom seems questionable. Knowing the form of justice in the abstract doesn't necessarily tell you what the just policy is in a particular situation with specific constraints and circumstances. Practical wisdom, phronesis, requires judgment about particulars, not just knowledge of universals. A philosopher-king might understand justice itself perfectly, but still make bad practical decisions through lack of experience, poor judgment, or inadequate understanding of human nature and political realities. The political proposals face perhaps the strongest objections. Let's consider the major criticisms. The abolition of private family among guardians seems psychologically unrealistic and morally problematic. Can you really prevent parents from forming special attachments to their own children? Can you prevent children from wanting to know their biological parents? The plan requires that parents not know which children are theirs, but surely a woman who has given birth remembers approximately when it occurred, and she'll have special feelings toward children of that age. The biological bond between parent and child is powerful, and Plato's scheme requires suppressing it through deception and force. Moreover, is the family really just a source of corruption? Doesn't it also teach valuable virtues? Love, care, responsibility, sacrifice? The family is where most people first learn to care about someone other than themselves. Eliminating it might prevent some forms of nepotism and corruption, but it might also create people incapable of deep personal bonds, people who have no experience of intimate particular love. A city full of such people might be unified in a superficial sense, but it would lack genuine community and solidarity. The eugenic breeding program treats human reproduction as animal husbandry, which violates human dignity and autonomy. People aren't horses or dogs to be bred for desirable traits. They're rational beings with inherent worth who should have the right to choose their partners and determine their reproductive lives. Plato's scheme reduces one of the most intimate human activities to a state-controlled program aimed at producing better guardians, with no regard for individual choice, love, or personal relationships. Additionally, even if we set aside moral objections, eugenic breeding faces practical problems. Which traits should be selected for? Intelligence, physical strength, beauty, courage? These might not all be genetically correlated, and our ability to identify them in young children is limited. Worse, human genetics is complex. Traits don't breed true as simply as Plato assumes. Two intelligent parents might have a less intelligent child. Two mediocre guardians might produce a brilliant one. The program would require constant intervention and adjustment, probably generating more problems than it solves. The Philosopher-King proposal faces the objection that wisdom doesn't translate into political effectiveness. Being good at philosophy, at abstract reasoning, dialectical argument, contemplation of forms, is very different from being good at politics, which requires practical judgment, understanding of human psychology, negotiation skills, the ability to compromise, and often the willingness to work with imperfect circumstances and imperfect people. There's no reason to think these skill sets coincide. Moreover, concentrating power in Philosopher-Kings with no checks or accountability creates enormous potential for abuse. Even if the first generation of Philosopher-Kings are genuinely wise and well-intentioned, what about subsequent generations? How do you ensure the system doesn't degenerate? Plato acknowledges in books 8 and 9 that even the ideal city will eventually decline, but he doesn't explain how to prevent or slow this decline. Without mechanisms for accountability, correction, or renewal, the Philosopher-King regime seems unstable. The three-class structure and the noble lie raise questions about equality and deception. Why should people accept being permanently assigned to a class based on supposedly natural aptitude? Even if aptitudes differ, why should social role be entirely determined by aptitude? Shouldn't people have some choice about what life to lead? And using a myth about metals mixed in at birth to justify class structure seems manipulative. Even if Plato calls it noble, it's still deliberately deceiving people to make them accept a social order they might otherwise question. The ethical theory also has limitations. Plato defines justice as proper ordering of the soul, but this doesn't fully capture what we ordinarily mean by justice. Justice usually involves ideas about fairness, equality, rights, treating people as they deserve. Plato's account focuses on internal psychic harmony, which seems to be about personal virtue rather than justice in the social sense. Someone with a perfectly ordered soul might still treat others unjustly if their reason calculates that injustice serves their interests, though Plato would deny this is possible. Moreover, the claim that justice always benefits the just person, regardless of circumstances, seems too strong. Plato argues that even if the just person is tortured and executed, while the unjust person prospers, the just person is still happier because they have internal order. But this seems counterintuitive. Internal order might be necessary for happiness, but surely external circumstances matter too. A just person being tortured is not happy, even if their soul is well ordered. Plato seems forced to this extreme claim to answer Glaucon's challenge, but it strains credibility. The treatment of women is ambiguous. On one hand, Plato argues that women can be guardians and rulers if they have the appropriate natural aptitudes, which is remarkably progressive for ancient Greece. On the other hand, he assumes that women are generally inferior to men in most capacities, and his argument for including women in the guardian class is based on functional utility rather than equal rights or inherent dignity. Women should be guardians not because they have equal moral worth, but because wasting potential guardian talent is inefficient. Furthermore, the arrangements Plato proposes for guardian women, communal reproduction, no private families, military training, might be more oppressive than liberating. Women in the guardian class have no control over their reproductive lives, no opportunity to raise their own children, no private domestic sphere. They're completely absorbed into public functions. Whether this is progress or simply a different form of oppression is debatable. The rejection of democracy deserves particular scrutiny. Plato portrays democracy as anarchic and chaotic, where everyone does what they want with no guiding principle. But this seems like a caricature. Democracy at its best involves meaningful political participation, equality under law, deliberative debate, and collective decision-making that respects diverse perspectives. Yes, democracy has problems: uninformed voters, demagoguery, majority tyranny. But Plato doesn't seriously engage with defenses of democracy. He doesn't consider that dispersed decision-making might be wiser than centralized control, or that political equality might be valuable even if people have unequal expertise. Moreover, Plato's own proposal faces similar problems. If most people can't be trusted to vote wisely because they lack knowledge, why should we trust that the philosophers really have knowledge? Plato assumes philosophers have access to objective truth through contemplation of forms, but this assumption might be wrong. Perhaps there is no such objective truth about political matters, or perhaps it's not accessible through philosophical contemplation. If philosophers are just as fallible as everyone else, giving them unchecked power is dangerous. The critique of poetry seems excessive and inconsistent. Plato wants to ban most poetry from the ideal city because it appeals to emotion rather than reason and depicts base characters that might corrupt people who imitate them. But this assumes art has straightforward causal effects on behavior, which is questionable. Does reading Homer make you more violent? Does watching tragedy make you weaker? The empirical evidence for such effects is mixed at best. Moreover, as mentioned earlier, Plato himself uses powerful literary techniques, vivid imagery, dramatic dialogue, emotionally compelling myths. If poetry corrupts by engaging emotion rather than reason, doesn't the Republic itself corrupt? Plato might respond that philosophical literature is different because it ultimately serves reason, using emotion and imagery as pedagogical tools. But this distinction is hard to maintain consistently. If philosophical literature can use artistic techniques without corrupting, why can't other literature do the same? Contemporary relevance. Despite these criticisms, the Republic remains remarkably relevant to contemporary debates. Let's explore several areas where Plato's insights illuminate current issues. The role of expertise in politics is hotly contested today. We face increasingly complex policy questions about climate change, public health, economic regulation, artificial intelligence that require specialized knowledge. Should these decisions be made by experts or by democratic vote? Plato would say experts, of course, but we've seen how expert rule can go wrong when experts lack accountability or when they're captured by special interests. Yet pure democracy on technical matters seems problematic too. Should we vote on whether vaccines work or what monetary policy to pursue? We need systems that combine expertise with accountability, technical competence with democratic legitimacy. Plato's challenge to democracy, even if we reject his solution, forces us to think about how to balance these values. Questions about education and character formation are central to contemporary debates. What should schools teach? Is education primarily about knowledge and skills or about character and values? Should we focus on STEM education for economic competitiveness or on humanities for civic virtue and wisdom? Should education aim to maximize individual potential or to serve social needs? Plato would say, education should form character and orient people toward truth, with different educational tracks for people with different aptitudes. While we might reject his specific proposals, his insistence that education is fundamentally about shaping souls and serving the common good challenges purely instrumental approaches to education. The nature of justice remains contested. Is justice primarily about fair distribution of resources? About equal rights and opportunities? About proper procedures and rule of law? Or, as Plato argues, about proper internal order of the soul and society? Contemporary political philosophy includes utilitarian approaches that focus on outcomes, deontological approaches that focus on rights and duties, contractarian approaches that focus on fair agreements, and virtue ethical approaches closer to Plato that focus on character and excellence. Plato's account, even if incomplete, reminds us that justice might involve more than external arrangements. It might require attention to psychology, character, and the proper ordering of our desires and values. Issues of social unity versus diversity echo Platonic themes. Plato values unity extremely highly. The ideal city should be as unified as possible, with all citizens sharing pleasures and pains. But contemporary societies are deeply diverse, containing people with different religions, values, cultures, and ways of life. Should we try to create unity through shared education and culture, as Plato suggests? Or should we embrace diversity and pluralism, allowing different communities to pursue different visions of the good life? Plato would see excessive diversity as fragmenting the city and preventing common purpose, but critics worry that imposed unity becomes oppressive, eliminating valuable differences and demanding conformity. How to balance unity and diversity remains a fundamental challenge. Questions about meritocracy and social hierarchy relate to Plato's three-class system. Should society be organized hierarchically based on merit and ability? If so, how do we measure merit, and how much inequality should we accept? Plato argues for assigning social roles based on natural aptitude. The most capable should rule. Others should follow their direction. This is meritocratic in one sense. Everyone gets their position based on ability, not birth or wealth. But it's also rigidly hierarchical and potentially unequal. Contemporary societies struggle with similar tensions. We claim to value equal opportunity and meritocracy, but we're uncomfortable with the inequalities that result. We want to reward talent and effort, but we also want to ensure everyone has decent lives, regardless of their capacities. Plato's unflinching meritocracy challenges us to think about whether we really believe in merit-based hierarchy and how much inequality we're willing to accept. The relationship between individual and community is a perennial issue that Plato addresses. Should individual interests be subordinated to the common good? Or should society be organized to maximize individual freedom and choice? Plato clearly prioritizes the community. The ideal city assigns roles based on social needs, not individual preferences. Guardians are compelled to rule, even though they'd prefer to philosophize. Everyone's education and occupation is determined by what benefits the city. This seems collectivist and potentially oppressive to modern liberal sensibilities that prioritize individual rights and autonomy. Yet Plato might respond that true individuality requires proper social order. You can't flourish as an individual in a chaotic, unjust society. The community provides the conditions for individual development, so serving the community ultimately serves yourself. This debate between individualism and collectivism, between liberal and communitarian values, continues to structure much political philosophy. The role of truth and knowledge in politics is especially relevant in our post-truth era. Plato insists that politics should be based on knowledge of objective truth, not on opinion, rhetoric, or manipulation. Leaders should be those who know what's truly good, not those who are skilled at persuasion or appealing to popular prejudice. In an age of fake news, propaganda, and sophisticated manipulation of public opinion, Plato's insistence on truth seems more relevant than ever. Yet we also face the problem he didn't fully solve. How do we identify those who really have knowledge? Who determines what counts as truth? In pluralistic societies, people disagree about fundamental values and truths. Without agreement on truth, Plato's ideal of philosopher-kings seems impossible to implement, yet without some notion of truth and expertise, politics devolves into pure power struggle and manipulation. The psychology of motivation and self-control that Plato explores resonates with contemporary behavioral science and psychology. Modern research confirms that humans have multiple motivational systems, roughly corresponding to Plato's reason, spirit, and appetite. We have cognitive systems that plan for the future and evaluate options, emotional systems that respond to threats and opportunities for status, and appetitive systems that pursue immediate rewards. These systems sometimes conflict, producing akrasya or weakness of will. Plato's model of psychic health as integration under reason's rule parallels modern conceptions of psychological well-being as involving emotional regulation, impulse control, and alignment between values and behavior. While the details differ, Plato's basic insight that mental health requires proper ordering of multiple motivational systems remains valuable. Questions about the good life are eternal. What makes life worth living? What should we value? How should we live? Plato argues that the best life is the philosophical life, a life devoted to seeking truth, contemplating eternal realities, ordering one's soul according to reason. He contrasts this with lives devoted to honor, wealth, or pleasure, arguing these are inferior because they involve disorder and dependence on external goods. Contemporary people wrestle with similar questions. Should we prioritize career success, family relationships, creative expression, physical pleasure, social contribution, spiritual development? Plato's answer, prioritize wisdom and virtue above all else, challenges materialistic and hedonistic values. Whether his answer is correct remains debatable, but his insistence that we must think carefully about what makes life good, and that many common answers are wrong, remains valuable. The dialogue form and its significance. Before concluding, we should reflect on the significance of Plato's choice to write dialogues rather than treatises. The Republic is not a systematic philosophical work presenting Plato's doctrines. It's a dramatic dialogue featuring Socrates in conversation with others, set at a particular time and place, involving real historical characters. Why this form? Dialogues model philosophical activity rather than just presenting philosophical conclusions. We see Socrates questioning, arguing, considering objections, revising views. We witness the process of philosophical inquiry, not just its results. This invites us to engage actively, to question along with Socrates, to consider whether the arguments work. It makes philosophy something we do rather than something we passively receive. Dialogues allow for multiple perspectives. Different characters represent different positions. Thrasymachus's cynical realism, Glaucon's refined skepticism, Adimantus's practical concerns. Socrates responds to each, but the dialogue doesn't necessarily endorse everything Socrates says. We're left to evaluate the arguments ourselves, considering whether Socrates has really answered the objections or whether problems remain. Dialogues preserve ambiguity and interpretive openness. A treatise aims for clarity and definiteness. A dialogue can be deliberately ambiguous. Is Socrates serious about philosopher-kings? Is the ideal city meant to be realized? Should we accept the myth of literally? The dialogue form allows Plato to explore ideas without fully committing to them, to show both attractions and problems of positions without definitively resolving every question. Dialogues are more accessible and engaging than abstract philosophical prose. The characters, the drama, the vivid images, these make philosophy come alive. People who might never read a philosophical treatise can engage with a dialogue. Yet the dialogues contain sophisticated arguments that reward careful study. This combination of accessibility and depth has made Plato's dialogues endure, while many more systematic philosophical works are forgotten. Dialogues reflect the nature of philosophy itself as an ongoing conversation. Philosophy doesn't offer final answers but continuing inquiry. Each generation must grapple with fundamental questions anew. By writing dialogues rather than doctrines, Plato invites us into this conversation. We become participants, considering the questions and arguments, forming our own views. Philosophy happens in dialogue, between people, between ideas, between text and reader across centuries. Plato's legacy and influence. The influence of the Republic on Western philosophy and culture can hardly be overstated. Let's briefly trace some major lines of influence. In ancient philosophy, Aristotle, Plato's student, wrote extensive critiques of the Republic while also building on its insights. His political philosophy responds directly to Plato's, defending private property and family while accepting that politics should aim at the good life and that education is crucial. Subsequent ancient schools, Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics, all engage with Platonic themes about the good life, virtue, and happiness. In medieval philosophy, Plato's influence came largely through Augustine, who synthesized Platonic philosophy with Christianity. The forms became ideas in the mind of God. The cave allegory was reinterpreted as humanity in ignorance before divine revelation. The philosopher's ascent became the soul's journey to God. Medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, also engaged deeply with Plato's political and metaphysical ideas. In early modern philosophy, Plato's rationalism influenced Descartes and other thinkers who sought certain knowledge through reason rather than sense experience. The forms evolved into innate ideas or concepts knowable a priori. Plato's political ideas influenced utopian thinkers like More and Campanella, who imagined ideal societies organized according to rational principles. In modern political philosophy, the Republic has been read as anticipating various modern movements. Some see it as proto-communist, given its communal property and central planning. Others see it as proto-fascist, given its authoritarianism, eugenic breeding, and noble lies. Still others see it as proto-technocratic, advocating rule by experts. These readings are all anachronistic. Plato wasn't modern in any of these senses, but they show how the Republic raises issues that became central to modern politics. In contemporary philosophy, Plato's influence continues through multiple channels. Virtue ethics, revived in the late 20th century, draws heavily on Platonic and Aristotelian themes about character and excellence. Debates about moral realism, whether there are objective moral truths, often engage with Platonic metaphysics. Political philosophy continues to debate expertise versus democracy, individual versus community, unity versus diversity. All themes central to the Republic. Epistemology addresses questions about the nature of knowledge and its relation to opinion that Plato raised. In literature and culture, Platonic images and ideas pervade Western imagination. The cave allegory has been reimagined countless times, from Christian interpretations to the Matrix. The Philosopher-King ideal influences how we think about leadership and expertise. The tripartite soul shows up in popular psychology. The forms influence how we think about abstract objects and ideal standards. Plato's questions: what is justice? What makes life worth living? How should society be organized? Remain central to humanistic education and cultural discourse. Conclusion: the enduring questions of the Republic. As we reach the end of our journey through the Republic, what should we take away from this monumental work? Not, perhaps, agreement with all of Plato's specific proposals. Few readers accept philosopher-kings, communal families, and eugenic breeding as desirable. Not even, necessarily, acceptance of his metaphysics of forms or his psychological theory, though both contain insights. What endures from the Republic is less its answers than its questions, less its doctrines than its methodology, less its conclusions than its challenges. The central question, what is justice, remains as urgent today as in Plato's Athens. How should we live together? What do we owe each other? How should society be organized? What makes a social order legitimate? These questions can't be avoided, and easy answers won't do. Plato shows us that conventional definitions of justice don't withstand scrutiny, that we must think more deeply about what justice really is and why it matters. His answer, justice as psychic harmony, proper ordering of soul and city, might not fully satisfy us, but it challenges us to develop better answers. The question of expertise versus democracy continues to vex us. Should those with knowledge rule, or should power be distributed equally? How do we balance the benefits of expertise with the values of equality and autonomy? How do we prevent rule by experts from becoming rule by self-serving elites? Plato didn't solve this problem, but he identified it clearly and showed why it matters. Any adequate political philosophy must address it. The question of education's role and purpose remains central. What should we teach the young? How do we form character? What's the relationship between education and virtue, between knowledge and goodness? Plato insists these questions are fundamental to politics because cities are only as good as their citizens. We might disagree with his specific educational proposals, but we can't avoid the underlying issue. Education shapes souls, and souls shape society. The question of the relationship between individual and community requires ongoing attention. How much should individuals sacrifice for the common good? How much freedom should individuals have to pursue their own conception of the good life? Where's the proper balance between personal autonomy and social responsibility? Plato pushes us toward prioritizing community, perhaps too far, but he forces us to justify individualism if that's what we believe. The question of what makes life worth living is eternal. Is it pleasure, honor, wealth, power, knowledge, virtue, relationships, creative achievement? Plato argues for prioritizing wisdom and virtue, claiming that these bring happiness regardless of external circumstances. Whether he's right remains for each person to decide through how they live, but his challenge to examine our values and priorities carefully remains valid. The question of truth's role in politics has become especially pressing. Can we have meaningful politics without shared truth? Should leaders be those who know truth or those who represent popular will? How do we distinguish knowledge from opinion, expertise from pretense? In an age of competing narratives and epistemic fragmentation, Plato's insistence that truth matters and that some claims to knowledge are better than others seems both necessary and difficult to sustain. The methodological lesson of the Republic is perhaps most important. Plato shows us how to do philosophy, question assumptions, examine definitions, consider counterexamples, follow arguments wherever they lead, use analogies and thought experiments to clarify concepts, integrate insights from multiple domains: ethics, politics, psychology, metaphysics, epistemology. He demonstrates that philosophical inquiry requires both rigorous argument and imaginative vision, both logical analysis and intuitive insight. The dialogue form itself teaches us that philosophy happens through conversation, through exchange of ideas, through examining positions from multiple perspectives. The Republic doesn't provide a final answer to how we should live or how society should be organized. What it provides is a framework for thinking about these questions, a set of conceptual tools, arguments, images, and distinctions that help us examine our own beliefs and values more carefully. It challenges comfortable assumptions and forces us to defend our views with arguments, not just assertions. It shows us what's at stake in political and ethical questions. Not just practical matters of policy, but fundamental questions about human nature, knowledge, value, and the good life. The ideal city constructed in speech may never exist on earth, as Socrates himself acknowledges, but it exists as a paradigm, a standard we can use to evaluate actual cities and guide reform. Similarly, the perfectly just soul may be an ideal we never fully achieve. But the ideal matters because it gives us something to aim at, a direction for improvement. Even if we can't become perfectly just, we can become more just by orienting ourselves toward the ideal. This is Plato's final message. We should care for our souls above all else. We should seek truth, practice virtue, order our desires according to reason, and live in accordance with what's truly good rather than what merely appears good. The just life is the best life, not because it brings external rewards, though Plato claims it does, but because it constitutes human flourishing. To live with a well-ordered soul, guided by wisdom, supported by courage, disciplined by moderation, and integrated by justice, this is what it means to live well. Whether we accept this vision or not, we can't avoid the questions Plato raises. Over 2,000 years after its composition, the Republic remains not a historical curiosity, but a living text that speaks to perennial human concerns. As long as humans wonder about justice, truth, the good life, and how to organize society, Plato's dialogue will continue to provoke, challenge, and inspire. This is the mark of genuine philosophy. Not that it provides final answers, but that it helps us ask better questions and think more carefully about matters that ultimately determine how we live.